Andromeda Tonks could have ignored the letter. It would have been safer, certainly easier, and far more sensible than what she was about to do instead. But as she sat at her kitchen table on the morning of July 29th, watching steam curl up from her coffee cup while Ted read the prophet aloud and Nymphadora practiced changing her nose into increasingly ridiculous shapes, the unopened Muggle envelope seemed to pulse with urgency. "Mum, look at this one." Dora's nose had become a perfect replica of a toucan's beak, complete with bright orange colouring. "Reckon the Slytherins will fancy this for my last year." "Your last year," Ted said, folding the newspaper with satisfaction. "Hard to believe our little metamorph Magus is nearly done with Hogwarts. What will we do without your chaos to keep us entertained?" Andromeda smiled, but her attention kept drifting to the letter. It had arrived with the regular Muggle post, addressed in careful block letters to Mrs. A. Tonks, with no return address. Living on the edges of both worlds meant they occasionally received misdirected correspondence, but something about this one felt different, heavier, more deliberate. "Earth to Mum." Dora's voice cut through her distraction. Her daughter had returned her features to normal and was studying Andromeda with the sharp perception that came from 17 years of reading her mother's moods. "You've been staring at that letter for 10 minutes. Either open it or bin it, but the suspense is killing, Dad." "I wasn't," Ted began, but Andromeda was already reaching for the envelope. The paper was ordinary Muggle stationery, but the handwriting inside was shaky, uncertain. As her eyes moved across the lines, Andromeda felt something cold settle in her stomach. "Mrs. Tonks, I hope this reaches the right person. I got your address from someone who said you might care about children being hurt. I live on Privet Drive, in Little Whinging, Surrey, and there's a boy at number 4 who I think needs help. I've watched him for years now. He's thin, too thin, and always wearing clothes that don't fit. The man who lives there, Vernon Dursley, shouts at him something awful. The woman never speaks up for him. I've seen the boy doing heavy garden work while the other child, a fat little thing, sits inside watching television. Yesterday I saw them lock him in his room. I heard him crying through the window. He's just a little boy, maybe 9 or 10. His name is Harry. I don't know what else to do. The Muggle authorities won't help because the family keeps up appearances. But I think you people might understand what I cannot. Please. Someone needs to look after him." A concerned neighbor, Andromeda, read the letter twice before the words fully registered. The kitchen had gone quiet around her. Ted was watching her face with growing alarm, and Dora had leaned forward, her hair unconsciously darkening to match her mother's suddenly grim expression. "Mum?" Dora's voice was smaller now, younger. "What is it?" Andromeda set the letter down carefully, as though it might explode. "Ted, do you remember the Potter boy? James Potter's son?" "Of course. Poor little thing, after what happened to his parents." Ted's brow furrowed. "Why do you ask?" "Because I think someone just told us where he's been living for the past 9 years. She passed the letter across the table, watching Ted's expression change as he read. "And it sounds like he's been living in hell." Ted's hands tightened on the paper. As a Muggle-born, he understood the nuances of this kind of letter better than most wizards would. This person is careful not to say anything that would expose magic directly. But the phrasing... He looked up at Andromeda. "They know about our world. They know you're a witch." "But they're using Muggle post," Dora pointed out, her metamorphmagus abilities responding to stress by cycling through hair colors at an alarming rate. "Why not use an owl?" Andromeda felt a familiar ache in her chest, the old wound of being cast out, of having no official place in either world. "Because they know I'm disowned. cut off from most magical communication networks. If you wanted to reach someone who existed in the spaces between worlds, someone who might actually do something about a magical child being abused by muggles, she let the implication hang in the air. Dumbledore placed him there, Ted said quietly. The whole wizarding world knows that much. If this is true, if Harry Potter is being mistreated, then the great Albus Dumbledore has some explaining to do. The words came out harder than Andromeda intended, edged with years of accumulated anger at powerful men who made decisions for others without facing consequences. She had been 19 when her family disowned her for marrying Ted. 19 and terrified and absolutely convinced she was doing the right thing. The memory of that conviction, that willingness to act when others wouldn't, stirred something fierce in her chest. "What are we going to do?" Dora asked. Andromeda looked at her daughter. 17, brilliant, brave enough to become an aura, and compassionate enough to ask that question without hesitation. "We're going to help him." "Andromeda," Ted said carefully. "If this is true, we're talking about directly contradicting the placement of the boy who lived. The political implications alone." "The political implications," Andromeda interrupted, standing abruptly, "are considerably less important than the fact that a 9-year-old child is apparently being starved and imprisoned by the people who are supposed to be caring for him." She began pacing, her mind already working through possibilities. "I know someone at St. Mungo's. Miriam Clearwater. She's a healer, specializing in pediatric cases. If I could convince her to come with me." "To do what, exactly?" Ted's legal training was showing. "You can't just walk up to a muggle house and demand to examine their child." "I can if I have reason to believe the child is in immediate danger." Andromeda stopped pacing and looked at him directly. "Ted, you're a solicitor. You know there are protections for children that supersede guardian rights, even in the muggle world. And in the magical world." She paused, thinking. "Actually, I'm not entirely certain what the laws are regarding magical children placed with muggle guardians. How often does that happen?" "It doesn't," Dora said slowly. "Not officially. Magical children are always placed with magical families, or at least squib relatives who understand the risks. The only exception I can think of would be if there were extraordinary circumstances requiring blood protection or—" She stopped, her eyes widening. "Oh. What?" Ted looked between them. "Blood protection," Andromeda said grimly. "Lily Potter's sacrifice. If Harry was placed with her sister to maintain some kind of magical protection—" She felt pieces clicking together in her mind. That would explain why Dumbledore was so specific about the placement, but it doesn't excuse allowing the child to be abused. The kitchen fell silent again. Outside, birds were singing in the garden Ted had been tending before breakfast, and the morning sun was streaming through the windows with the golden promise of a beautiful day. Inside, 3 people were staring at a letter that might upend everything. "I have to go to him," Andromeda said finally. "I have to see for myself what's happening to that child." "Then we go together," Ted said immediately. "Dad!" Dora started. "No." Ted's voice was firm. "If we're doing this, we do it properly. I'll research the legal framework while you contact your healer friend. Dora, you can help me understand the magical implications of interfering with whatever protections might be in place." Andromeda felt a rush of love so intense it nearly took her breath away. This was why she had chosen Ted Tonks over her family's approval, why she had walked away from black family gold and pure blood connections without a backward glance. When it mattered, when a child needed protection, he didn't hesitate. "I'll owl Miriam immediately," she said, moving toward the writing desk in the corner. "If I explain the situation correctly, I think she'll agree to come. She's seen too many cases of magical children harmed by ignorant or abusive guardians to ignore something like this. "What if we're wrong?" Dora asked quietly. "What if the letter is exaggerating or mistaken or—" "Then we'll have spent a day making certain a child is safe," Andromeda replied, already pulling parchment from the drawer. "I can live with that kind of mistake. I couldn't live with ignoring this, and later learning we could have helped." As she dipped her quill in ink, Andromeda thought about her own childhood in Grimold Place, the cold halls and colder relatives, the way love had always come with conditions and expectations. She thought about Dora's childhood in this house, filled with laughter and acceptance, and the radical notion that family meant safety. Every child deserved what Dora had received. Every child deserved to be protected. If Harry Potter wasn't getting that protection, then someone needed to provide it. And if that someone happened to be a disowned black daughter with a muggle-born husband and access to the finest pediatric healer at St. Mungo's, then perhaps her disownment would finally serve a useful purpose. The morning of July 30th found Andromeda standing at the corner of Privet Drive with healer Miriam Clearwater, both women disguised under carefully crafted glamour charms that made them appear as unremarkable social workers in sensible shoes and navy blazers. The suburban street stretched before them in pristine uniformity, identical lawns mowed to regulation height, matching garden gnomes, and not a single blade of grass out of place. "Cheerful," Miriam murmured, adjusting the clipboard that held their fabricated paperwork. She was a small, sharp-featured woman in her 40s, whose gentle bedside manner masked a spine of steel forged in the pediatric trauma ward. Nothing says, "Everything is perfectly normal here," quite like pathological tidiness. Andromeda studied number 4 through narrowed eyes. The house looked exactly like every other house on the street, which somehow made it more unsettling. "The letter said the child does garden work. I don't see how any of these gardens could need much tending." "Control," Miriam said immediately. "It's not about the garden needing work, it's about making the child work." She had seen it too many times. Adults who found reasons to punish children, who created tasks designed to exhaust and humiliate rather than teach or help. They walked slowly down the pavement, noting the way curtains twitched in windows as they passed. Privet Drive was the sort of neighborhood where strangers were noticed immediately and discussed at length over tea and biscuits. By the time they reached number 4, Andromeda suspected their arrival had been reported to half the street. "There," Miriam said quietly, nodding toward the front garden. Andromeda followed her gaze and felt her heart clench. A boy was kneeling beside the flower bed, carefully weeding around stunted petunias with hands that seemed too large for his thin wrists. He was small, far too small for what she guessed his age to be, and the clothes he wore hung off his frame like fabric draped over a scarecrow. Dark hair fell across his forehead, hiding his face as he worked with the mechanical precision of someone who had performed this task many times before. "Sweet Merlin," Andromeda breathed. Even from a distance, even without her healer training, it was obvious that something was very wrong. The child moved carefully, as though his body hurt, and when he shifted to reach a different section of the garden, Andromeda caught a glimpse of purple shadowing around his left eye that makeup couldn't hide. "We go in now," Miriam said, her professional calm slipping to reveal the steel beneath. "I don't care what permissions we have to circumvent or what charms we have to use. That child needs medical attention immediately." They approached the front door with the brisk confidence of officials who belonged there. Andromeda knocked firmly, then nodded to Miriam, who discreetly cast a mild confundus charm at the lock. Not enough to cause lasting harm, but sufficient to make whoever answered the door more cooperative and less likely to ask uncomfortable questions about their credentials. The door opened to reveal a thin woman with a long neck and sharp features. her blonde hair pulled back so severely it seemed to stretch her skin. This had to be Petunia Dursley, Harry's aunt, and the resemblance to descriptions of Lily Potter was startling and heartbreaking. Where Lily had been described as warm and vibrant, this woman radiated pinched disapproval and barely contained anxiety. "Mrs. Dursley?" Andromeda stepped forward with the authoritative smile she had perfected during years of navigating bureaucracy as a disowned black. "I'm Mrs. Williams from Child Protective Services, and this is Dr. Clearwater from the County Health Department. We're here regarding reports of concern about a child in your care." Petunia's face went pale, then flushed red. "I don't know what you mean. There's been no... We don't. Who reported?" "May we come in?" Miriam's voice was professionally gentle, but implacable. "We just need to have a quick chat and ensure that young Harry is healthy and happy." The Confundus charm did its work. Petunia stepped aside, her movements jerky and uncertain. "Of course. Yes, I suppose. Vernon isn't home from work yet, but I'm sure he'll want to. Harry's just doing some gardening. Keeping busy, you know. Children need structure." They followed her into the house, and Andromeda immediately noted the obsessive cleanliness. Everything was polished to a shine, arranged with mathematical precision, and utterly devoid of any sign that a child lived there. No scattered toys, no school papers on the refrigerator, no small fingerprints on the walls. It was a house designed for display, not for living. "Could we see Harry, please?" Miriam asked, already scanning the room with the trained eye of someone accustomed to reading between the lines of family dynamics. "He's still working in the garden," Petunia said quickly. "I don't like to interrupt him when he's focused on his chores. He gets distracted easily, and then the work doesn't get done properly." "I'm sure he can spare a few minutes," Andromeda said firmly. "We won't keep him long." Petunia called toward the garden with obvious reluctance. "Harry! Harry, come inside, now!" The boy who appeared in the doorway made Andromeda's chest tighten with a fury so immediate and visceral she had to grip her hands behind her back to keep from reaching for her wand. Up close, the signs of neglect and abuse were impossible to ignore. Harry was painfully thin, his cheekbones sharp beneath skin that had the greyish pallor of chronic malnourishment. The bruising around his eye was clearly recent, but there were other marks, a healing cut on his lip, finger-shaped bruises around his upper arm, visible where his oversized shirt had slipped. But it was his eyes that broke her heart. They were the bright green that every witch and wizard in Britain knew from newspaper photographs, but they held a wariness that no 9-year-old should possess. He looked at the two strange women with the calculated caution of someone much older, already assessing potential threats and planning escape routes. "Hello, Harry," Miriam said softly, crouching down to put herself at his eye level. "I'm Dr. Clearwater. We're just here to make sure you're feeling well. Is that all right?" Harry glanced quickly at his aunt, reading her expression before answering. "Yes, Mum," he said quietly. "I'm fine." "I'm sure you are," Miriam agreed gently. "But would it be all right if I took a quick look at you anyway? Sometimes people feel fine, even when their bodies need a little extra care." Andromeda watched Harry's internal struggle play out across his features. He wanted to refuse. She could see it in the tightening around his eyes. But years of conditioning made him compliant. "If Aunt Petunia says it's okay." "Of course it's okay," Petunia said shrilly, wringing her hands. "Harry's perfectly healthy. We take very good care of him. He has 3 meals a day and a clean place to sleep and—" "Where does he sleep?" Andromeda asked, the question slipping out before she could stop it. The silence that followed was telling. Harry's face went carefully blank, while Petunia's mouth opened and closed soundlessly. "I'd like to see his room, please," Miriam said, rising to her full height. The gentleness was still there, but steel had crept into her voice. "His room," Petunia repeated faintly. "Yes, where Harry sleeps at night." More silence. Harry was staring at the floor now, his thin shoulders hunched as though he were trying to disappear. Andromeda felt something cold and terrible settling in her stomach. "Mrs. Dursley," she said carefully, "where exactly does Harry sleep?" Petunia's face crumpled with a mixture of shame and defiance. She led them to a door beneath the staircase, a door that Andromeda had assumed led to a coat closet or storage space. When Petunia opened it, revealing a cramped space, barely large enough for the narrow cot shoved against one wall, Andromeda felt the world tilt. The cupboard, because that's what it was, not a room, was perhaps 6 feet long and 4 feet wide. A bare light bulb hung from the low ceiling, and the walls were lined with coats and cleaning supplies. The cot had no pillows, just a thin blanket that looked like it had seen better days years ago. The only personal belongings visible were a few broken toys in one corner and what looked like school books stacked on the floor. "This is where he sleeps." Miriam's professional composure had cracked entirely. "In a cupboard?" "It's perfectly adequate," Petunia said defensively, but her voice shook. "He has everything he needs, and it's not like he requires much space." "He's a child, not a house elf," Andromeda snapped, abandoning any pretense of professional neutrality. "You've been keeping a 9-year-old boy in a closet?" Harry spoke for the first time since they'd begun this conversation, his voice barely above a whisper. "It's not so bad. It's quiet and no one bothers me there." The resignation in his voice, the acceptance that this was normal, that this was what he deserved, made Andromeda want to hex something. Or someone. Preferably whoever had decided that this was an acceptable place for the child of Lily and James Potter to live. Miriam knelt beside Harry again, her hands shaking slightly as she reached into her bag for her medical equipment. "Harry, I need to check your arms and legs to make sure you're not hurt anywhere. Is that all right?" He nodded, rolling up his sleeves with the automatic compliance of someone accustomed to being examined for damage. The bruises on his arms were clearly visible now, some fresh, some fading to yellow-green. When Miriam gently palpated his ribs, Harry winced and pulled away. "How did you get hurt here?" Miriam asked, her voice carefully neutral as she indicated a particularly dark bruise along his ribcage. Harry's eyes darted to his aunt, then back to the floor. "I fell down the stairs." "When?" "Yesterday." "And this one?" She pointed to the bruising around his eye. "I walked into a door." The lies came easily, automatically, and Andromeda realized with growing horror that Harry had been telling these lies for years. He had been trained to protect his abusers, to take responsibility for injuries that had clearly been inflicted deliberately. "Mrs. Dursley," Miriam said, standing and turning to face Petunia with the full force of her professional authority. "I need you to explain to me how a child in your care has sustained multiple injuries consistent with physical abuse, is severely underweight, and has been living in conditions that would be considered inadequate for storing household items, let alone housing a human being." Petunia's face had gone white. "You don't understand. Harry he's not a normal child. He's difficult. He breaks things, and he has these episodes. We have to keep him contained for everyone's safety." "Episodes?" Andromeda's voice was dangerously quiet. "Freakish things," Petunia whispered, the word carrying years of fear and resentment. "Unnatural things. He makes windows explode and sets curtains on fire and—" "He's a child manifesting accidental magic," Andromeda said flatly. "Perfectly normal for children from magical families, and absolutely no excuse for the treatment you've subjected him to." The admission hung in the air between them. Petunia's mouth fell open as she realized what she had revealed, while Harry looked up at Andromeda with something that might have been hope flickering in his green eyes. Miriam was writing rapidly on her clipboard, documenting everything she had observed. "Mrs. Dursley, I'm going to need you to contact your husband immediately. We have serious concerns about Harry's welfare, and there will need to be an immediate investigation." "You can't," Petunia said desperately. "You don't understand. We were told. Dumbledore said—" "Dumbledore?" Andromeda's voice cut through Petunia's babbling like a blade. "What did Albus Dumbledore tell you?" But before Petunia could answer, the sound of a car door slamming in the driveway announced that Vernon Dursley had arrived home, and from the heavy footsteps approaching the front door, Andromeda suspected their quiet investigation was about to become considerably more complicated. Vernon Dursley's arrival could be heard 3 houses away. The man's thunderous voice carried through the thin walls as he bellowed at his wife for allowing freaks into his house, and Andromeda found herself instinctively moving closer to Harry as the boy flinched at each raised word. "Get them out!" Vernon's voice boomed from the entryway. "I don't care what authority they claim to have. No one investigates this family without my permission." Miriam looked up from where she was still examining Harry's ribs, her face grim with professional determination. "Mrs. Tonks, I need 10 minutes. Can you handle the husband while I complete my examination?" "Absolutely." Andromeda's voice carried the ice-cold authority she had learned navigating black family politics. "Take all the time you need." She stepped into the hallway to find Vernon Dursley advancing toward them, a massive man whose bulk filled the narrow space, his face purple with rage, and his small eyes fixed on Harry with unmistakable malice. Behind him, Petunia wrung her hands and made small, distressed noises. "You have no right to be in my house," Vernon snarled, jabbing a thick finger in Andromeda's direction. "That boy is our responsibility, and we don't need interference from your sort." "Our sort?" Andromeda's voice was dangerously quiet. "And what sort would that be, Mr. Dursley?" Vernon's mouth opened and closed for a moment before he caught himself. "Government busybodies with nothing better to do than harass decent families." "Decent families," Andromeda repeated slowly. "Don't keep children in cupboards." "That boy is lucky we took him in at all," Vernon spat. "After what his parents were, after the damage he's done to this house, he's lucky we give him a roof over his head and food in his belly." "What damage?" Miriam's voice cut across the argument as she emerged from the living room, her medical bag in one hand and a portable device that looked like a cross between a stethoscope and a crystal ball in the other. "What damage has a 9-year-old child done that justifies keeping him in a space smaller than most people's wardrobes?" Vernon's face went from purple to an alarming shade of red. "Freakish things, unnatural things, windows exploding, furniture moving on its own, fires starting from nothing. The boy's not right, and someone has to keep him under control." Andromeda watched Harry during this exchange, noting how the child seemed to shrink into himself with each accusation, his thin shoulders hunching as though trying to disappear entirely. The self-blame in his posture was heartbreaking. He genuinely believed he deserved this treatment. "Mr. Dursley," Miriam said, with the patience of someone accustomed to dealing with difficult adults, "what you're describing sounds like accidental magic, which is completely normal for children from magical families. It's not something that needs to be controlled through punishment. It needs to be understood and properly guided." The admission hung in the air for a moment before Vernon's expression shifted from anger to something approaching panic. "You're one of them, aren't you? One of those freaks." "We're here to help Harry," Andromeda said firmly. "Dr. Clearwater needs to complete her examination to ensure he's receiving proper care." "He doesn't need examining," Vernon blustered. "He's fed, he's housed, he goes to school when he's not causing trouble." "When he's not causing trouble?" Miriam's voice had gone very quiet. "Are you saying you withhold education as punishment?" Vernon's mouth snapped shut, but the damage was done. Andromeda filed the admission away with all the other evidence they were gathering. "I'm going to complete Harry's examination now," Miriam announced, her tone brooking no argument. "This will include some specialized testing to ensure he hasn't suffered any magical injuries. I strongly suggest you cooperate fully." She gestured for Andromeda and Harry to return to the living room, leaving Vernon glowering in the hallway. Once they were seated, Miriam began unpacking equipment that looked far more sophisticated than anything a Muggle doctor would carry. "Harry," she said gently, "I'm going to use some special instruments to make sure you're healthy. Some of them might seem strange, but they won't hurt at all. Is that all right?" Harry nodded, his green eyes wide, as he watched Miriam assemble what looked like a portable scanning array. Crystal prisms caught the afternoon light streaming through the windows, casting rainbow patterns across the walls, while delicate silver instruments hummed with barely audible magical energy. "This first scan will check for any physical injuries or illnesses," Miriam explained, running a wand-like device slowly over Harry's small form. The crystal at its tip glowed softly, changing colors as it moved. "The light shows me how healthy different parts of your body are." The results were immediately visible on a small mirror-like surface attached to the scanner. Andromeda watched in growing horror as areas of Harry's body lit up in concerning shades of yellow and red, indicating malnutrition, stunted growth, and old injuries that had healed improperly. "Chronic malnutrition," Miriam murmured, making notes on a piece of parchment that wrote itself as she spoke. "Growth retardation, consistent with long-term dietary insufficiency. Evidence of at least 3 poorly healed bone fractures, 2 ribs and the left wrist. Vitamin deficiencies across the board." She moved to a different instrument, this one incorporating what looked like a small, pensive bowl filled with swirling silver mist. "This will check for any magical injuries or irregularities." The moment the scanning spell touched Harry's forehead, everything changed. The silver mist in the bowl turned black, roiling and churning as though something was fighting to escape. Miriam jerked backward, her face going pale as alarms began sounding from multiple devices simultaneously. "What is that?" Andromeda demanded, moving protectively toward Harry, who was staring at the instruments in confusion. "I don't know," Miriam whispered, her hands shaking as she tried to interpret the readings. "There's something foreign attached to his magical signature, something that shouldn't be there." She cast a more specific detection spell, and the results made her sink into the nearest chair. "Sweet Merlin, there's a soul fragment attached to his magical core." "A what?" Andromeda felt cold dread settling in her stomach. "A piece of someone else's soul," Miriam said, her voice barely audible. "Somehow bound to Harry's own life force. I've never seen anything like it, but the textbooks mention it only in the context of the darkest magic imaginable." Harry was looking between them with growing alarm. "Is something wrong with me? Am I sick?" "No, sweetheart," Andromeda said quickly, kneeling beside him. "You're not sick. Someone did something to you that they shouldn't have done. But you're not broken, and it's not your fault." Miriam had moved to another scanning device, this one focused specifically on detecting magical interference. The results made her curse under her breath, something Andromeda had never heard the mild-mannered healer do before. "There are compulsion charms," Miriam said, her professional composure cracking entirely. "Multiple layers of them, all bearing the same magical signature. Memory modification attempts, partially successful, and bindings on his magical core that are suppressing his natural abilities." "Whose signature?" Andromeda asked, though she already suspected the answer. Miriam ran the identification spell 3 times before she trusted the results. "Albus Dumbledore." The name hung in the air like a curse. Andromeda felt something cold and terrible settling in her chest as the implications hit her. The most respected wizard in Britain had not only placed Harry with abusive relatives, he had magically manipulated the child to ensure compliance. "The blood wards," Miriam continued, scanning the area around Harry with growing alarm. "They're connected to the family's location, but they've been deliberately weakened over time. The protection is barely functional." "Meaning?" "Meaning Harry has been left vulnerable to magical attack while being told he's safe. The wards that supposedly justify this placement are failing, and someone with access to them has been allowing that to happen." Andromeda looked at Harry, who was listening to this exchange with the wide-eyed attention of a child trying to understand why adults were so upset. She thought of Dumbledore's reputation, his supposed dedication to protecting children, his image as the defeater of dark wizards. And she thought of this small boy carrying a fragment of someone else's soul while being systematically starved and imprisoned by the very people entrusted with his care. "We need documentation," she said finally. "Complete documentation of everything you've found." "Already being recorded," Miriam replied, gesturing to the self-writing parchment that was now covering several feet of material. "But Andromeda, this goes beyond simple child abuse. What we're looking at here is systematic, magical torture of a minor, memory modification without consent, and—" She paused, staring at the readings again. "The soul fragment. If this is what I think it is, we're looking at evidence of magic so dark it was banned centuries ago." "What do you think it is?" Miriam's voice dropped to a whisper. "A Horcrux. A piece of someone's soul deliberately split and hidden to anchor them to life. If you know who somehow attached a piece of his soul to Harry during the attack that killed his parents—" She couldn't finish the thought. "Then Harry has been carrying a piece of Voldemort's soul for 9 years, Andromeda completed grimly, and Dumbledore has known about it. The evidence was overwhelming, damning, and absolutely clear. Harry Potter hadn't just been neglected. He had been deliberately placed in a situation designed to weaken and control him, all while carrying a piece of the darkest wizard of the century's soul in his scar. "We're taking him out of here," Andromeda said flatly. "Right now. Today. Andromeda, if we remove him from the blood ward anchor—" "The blood wards are already failing," Andromeda pointed out. "And they're obviously not worth the cost of what's being done to him here. Whatever protection they're providing isn't worth destroying a child's life for." Miriam nodded slowly, still cataloguing the magical damage they had uncovered. "The documentation will be enough to bring charges, multiple charges, against multiple people. This isn't just neglect, this is a conspiracy." Harry had been listening to their conversation with growing agitation, his small hands clenched in his lap. Finally, he spoke up in a voice so small it was barely audible. "Are you going to send me back to my cupboard?" The question broke Andromeda's heart all over again. After everything they had discovered, after all the evidence of systematic abuse and magical manipulation, this child's first concern was whether he was going to be punished for allowing them to examine him. "No," she said firmly, reaching out to take his small, cold hands in hers. "You are never going back to that cupboard. You are never going back to being hungry or hurt or locked away. Someone is going to take proper care of you from now on." "Promise?" "I promise." Outside, they could hear Vernon Dursley's voice rising again, shouting at his wife about consequences and what Dumbledore said would happen if anyone interfered. But Andromeda was no longer concerned with Vernon Dursley's threats or Dumbledore's supposed authority. She was concerned with getting one small, damaged boy to safety and making sure that everyone responsible for putting him in this situation faced the consequences of their choices. The moment Andromeda made her decision, everything else became secondary. Legal procedures, proper protocols, even the potential consequences of defying Albus Dumbledore. None of it mattered more than the fact that Harry Potter was sitting in front of her, carrying a piece of Voldemort's soul, while being systematically destroyed by the very people entrusted with his care. "We're leaving," she announced, standing and extending her hand to Harry. "Right now." Miriam looked up from her documentation, her expression shifting from medical professionalism to something approaching panic. "Andromeda, if we remove him without proper legal authorization—" "Then we'll face the legal consequences later," Andromeda replied firmly. "But I am not leaving this child in this house for 1 more hour. Not after what we've discovered." Harry stared at her outstretched hand with a mixture of confusion and terror that broke her heart. "I don't understand. Are you taking me somewhere else?" The question was so small, so uncertain, that Andromeda had to swallow hard before answering. "Yes, sweetheart. Somewhere safe. Somewhere you'll have a proper bedroom and regular meals and people who will never hurt you. But this is where I live, Harry said, his voice rising with the kind of panic that came from having no control over his own fate. I don't know anywhere else. What if I do something wrong? What if I break things and they don't want me either? Vernon's thunderous voice carried from the kitchen, where he was apparently attempting to contact someone, probably Dumbledore, using what sounded like increasingly frustrated phone calls. "Answer the bloody phone," he bellowed. "This is about the Potter boy." "Harry," Andromeda said gently, crouching down to his eye level. "Do you trust me?" Harry's green eyes, so much like his mother's, according to everyone who had known Lily, searched her face for a long moment. "I don't know," he whispered honestly. "I want to. But what if you change your mind?" The admission that he expected to be abandoned hit Andromeda like a physical blow. "I won't change my mind," she said firmly. "I promise you that. And if you come with me, you'll meet my daughter Nymphadora and my husband Ted, and they'll promise you the same thing. You have a family? Yes. And there's room in it for you, if you want there to be." Before Harry could respond, Vernon burst into the room like an enraged bull. "No one is taking that boy anywhere," he roared, his face purple with fury and what looked like genuine panic. "Dumbledore specifically said he was to stay here until he was ready for that freak school." "Mr. Dursley," Miriam said, rising to face him with her documentation clutched in her hands. "Based on my examination, this child requires immediate medical intervention and removal from this environment. The evidence of abuse is overwhelming." "Abuse?" Vernon's voice cracked slightly. "We've fed him and housed him and put up with his freakishness for 9 years. That's more than most people would do." "Fed him?" Andromeda's voice was dangerously quiet. "The child is severely malnourished. Housed him. In a cupboard under the stairs. Put up with his freakishness? You mean you've punished him for displaying normal magical development?" "It's not normal." Petunia's voice came from the doorway, where she hovered like a nervous bird. "Nothing about him is normal. The things he does, the way he looks at you, sometimes like he knows things he shouldn't know. He's a child," Andromeda said flatly. "A traumatized, abused child who has been carrying burdens no 9-year-old should have to bear." She turned back to Harry, who was pressed against the sofa as though trying to disappear. "Harry, I need you to come with me now." "What if they're right?" Harry whispered. "What if I am a freak? What if I hurt people without meaning to?" "Then we'll teach you how to control your magic properly," Andromeda replied. "That's what should have happened years ago. Magic isn't something to be ashamed of. It's a gift that needs proper guidance." Vernon made a sound like an angry boar. "You people and your delusions about gifts. The boy's dangerous. Dumbledore said keeping him under control was essential for everyone's safety." "Dumbledore said that, did he?" Andromeda's voice carried ice that would have made her black family ancestors proud. "How interesting." She turned back to Harry, who was watching the adults argue with the wide-eyed attention of someone accustomed to having his fate decided by others' anger. "Harry, do you want to stay here?" The question seemed to surprise him. "Do I have a choice?" "Yes. You always have a choice. It might not always be an easy choice, but you get to make it." Harry looked around the room, at Vernon's purpling face, at Petunia's pinched disapproval, at the cupboard door that stood slightly ajar like a mouth waiting to swallow him again. Then he looked back at Andromeda. "I want to go with you," he said quietly. "Then we're leaving," Andromeda announced. "Mr. Dursley, Mrs. Dursley, consider this official notification that Harry Potter is being removed from your care, pending a full investigation into his treatment." "You can't do this," Vernon sputtered. "I'm calling the police. I'm calling social services. I'm calling—" "Call whoever you like," Miriam said calmly, tucking her documentation into her bag. "I'll be filing my own reports with the appropriate authorities within the hour." Andromeda held out her hand to Harry again. This time, after a moment's hesitation, he took it. His fingers were so thin and cold that she had to resist the urge to wrap him in her robes immediately. "Do I need to pack anything?" Harry asked, uncertainly. Andromeda looked around the sterile living room, noting the complete absence of anything that belonged to a child. "Do you have belongings you want to bring?" Harry considered this seriously. "There's a broken toy soldier in my cupboard, and some books from school. We'll get them," Andromeda promised, though the fact that his only possessions were a broken toy and school books made her want to hex something. They retrieved Harry's meager belongings. The toy soldier was missing an arm and most of its paint, and the books were clearly hand-me-downs that had been read to pieces. Everything fit in a carrier bag that Vernon thrust at them, with obvious relief to be getting rid of the evidence. "This is kidnapping," Vernon declared as they moved toward the front door. "I'll have the law on you." "Go ahead," Andromeda replied calmly. "I'm sure they'll be very interested in your explanations for why a child in your care is malnourished, covered in bruises, and sleeping in a closet." Petunia had followed them to the door, wringing her hands and making small, distressed sounds. "You don't understand," she said suddenly. "We never wanted him. We never asked for this. Dumbledore just appeared and left him on the doorstep with a letter saying we had to take him. We didn't know what else to do." "You could have asked for help," Miriam pointed out. "You could have contacted social services or magical authorities or—" "And say what?" Petunia's voice cracked. "That we'd been left with a magical baby who made strange things happen? Who would have believed us?" "Someone would have," Andromeda said firmly. "Someone should have checked on you. Someone should have made sure you were equipped to care for a magical child." Her voice hardened. "Someone should have made sure Harry was safe." She guided Harry toward her car, or rather, what appeared to be her car to anyone watching. In reality, it was a carefully warded area where she could safely apparate without being observed by Muggle neighbors. "Are we really leaving?" Harry asked, looking back at number 4 Privet Drive with an expression that mixed relief and terror in equal measure. "We're really leaving," Andromeda confirmed. "Hold tight to my hand, and don't let go no matter what happens. This might feel strange." The sensation of apparition was always disorienting, but Harry handled it better than most children would have. He stumbled slightly when they materialized in the garden behind the Tonks house, but he didn't cry out or panic. What he did do was immediately let go of Andromeda's hand and back away from the house, his small frame tense with the expectation of punishment. "It's all right," Andromeda said gently. "This is my home. You're safe here." But even as she spoke, she could see that Harry didn't believe her. Safety wasn't a concept he understood. It was something he would have to learn, slowly and carefully, with patience she wasn't sure she possessed. The moment they arrived, alarms began sounding across magical London. Andromeda felt the blood wards snap like overstretched rubber bands, sending shockwaves through the magical monitoring systems that tracked such things. At the Ministry, emergency lights would be flashing. In Grimmauld Place, ancient ward stones would be screaming warnings. And wherever Albus Dumbledore was at this moment, he would be receiving urgent notifications that his carefully maintained protection had just collapsed. "What was that?" Harry asked, looking around nervously as though expecting something terrible to descend on them from the sky. "Nothing that concerns you anymore," Andromeda replied, though she could feel the magical turbulence in the air around them. "Come on, let's get you inside and introduce you to the family." Ted appeared in the kitchen doorway before they reached the house, his face creased with concern. "Andromeda?" I felt the wards react to something. He stopped short when he saw Harry, his expression shifting to one of protective fury as he took in the boy's condition. "Sweet Merlin." "Ted, meet Harry Potter," Andromeda said. "Harry, this is my husband, Ted. He's going to help us make sure you're safe." Ted crouched down to Harry's level, much as Andromeda had done earlier. "Hello, Harry. I'm very glad to meet you. though I'm sorry about the circumstances. Are you hungry? Andromeda's made enough soup to feed half of London, and I think there might be some chocolate biscuit somewhere." The kindness in Ted's voice seemed to surprise Harry almost as much as the offer of food. "Yes, sir, if it's not too much trouble." "No trouble at all," Ted assured him. "In fact, it would be doing us a favor. Dora's been eating us out of house and home, and we need all the help we can get." Meanwhile, in little whinging, Albus Dumbledore apparated onto Privet Drive to find number 4 empty, except for 2 very agitated Dursleys and a small elderly woman standing in the garden of number 2 with her arms crossed and a look of grim satisfaction on her weathered face. "Arabella," Dumbledore said, his voice carrying none of its usual grandfatherly warmth. "I don't suppose you know anything about what happened here today." Mrs. Figg adjusted her cat-print cardigan and met his gaze without flinching. "I know that someone finally did what should have been done years ago," she replied calmly. "I know that boy is finally somewhere safe. The blood protections were failing anyway." Mrs. Figg interrupted. "I've been watching, Albus. I've been reporting. And for 9 years you've done nothing while that child suffered." Her voice gained strength. "So yes, I wrote to someone who might actually help him, and I don't regret it for a moment." Dumbledore's eyes, usually twinkling with benevolent humor, had gone cold and hard. "You have interfered with protections you don't understand, Arabella. The consequences," Mrs. Figg said firmly, "are that Harry Potter is finally being treated like the child he is, instead of a burden to be hidden away. And if you have a problem with that, Professor, perhaps you should have paid better attention to what was happening under your nose." She turned and walked back into her house, leaving Dumbledore standing alone in the street, staring at the empty house where his carefully laid plans had just crumbled to dust. Harry Potter had never sat at a kitchen table where people wanted him to be there. The realization hit him as he perched carefully on the edge of the chair Ted had pulled out for him, his thin frame tensed as though ready to bolt at the first sign of displeasure. The Tonks family kitchen was everything the Dursleys' sterile space wasn't: warm, lived in, and filled with the comfortable clutter of people who actually used their home for living rather than display. "Watch her, Harry!" A voice from the doorway made him jump and nearly topple from his chair. "Sorry, didn't mean to startle you. I'm Nymphadora. But you can call me Dora or Tonks, or pretty much anything except Nymphadora if you want to stay on my good side." Harry stared at the girl who bounded into the kitchen with confident energy. She was clearly older than him, maybe 16 or 17, with bright purple hair that seemed to shift color as she moved, and a face that was both pretty and somehow changeable, as though she couldn't quite decide what she wanted to look like. "Your hair," he said before he could stop himself, then immediately hunched his shoulders in preparation for a scolding about speaking without permission. Instead, Dora grinned widely. "Brilliant observation. Watch this." She screwed up her face in concentration, and her hair rippled through a spectrum of colors before settling on a vibrant green that almost exactly matched Harry's eyes. "Metamorphmagus. It's a rare ability. I can change my appearance at will. Drives Mum absolutely mad when I practice during dinner." "Language, Nymphadora," Andromeda said, mildly, from where she was ladling soup into bowls. But there was affection in her voice, rather than real reproof. "See what I mean?" Dora stage whispered to Harry. "Use the full name if you want to torture me." She dropped into the chair beside him with casual ease. "So, Mum says you've had a rough go of it. Want to talk about it? Or would you rather hear embarrassing stories about my Hogwarts disasters?" Harry blinked at her, uncertain how to respond to such straightforward kindness. I don't know." "Disasters it is then," Dora declared cheerfully. "Did you know that in my 3rd year, I accidentally turned my entire defense against the dark arts class purple for a week?" Professor Merrythought was not amused. Despite himself, Harry felt his mouth twitch in what might have been the beginning of a smile. "You turned people purple?" "Purple with orange polka dots," Dora confirmed solemnly. "It was a very advanced transformation spell that I was definitely not ready for. The Hufflepuffs took it well enough. We're used to weird things happening. But the Slytherins were absolutely furious." Andromeda set a bowl of soup in front of Harry, and he stared at it with something approaching wonder. It was chicken and vegetable soup, thick with chunks of real meat and carrots and potatoes, and it smelled better than anything he could remember eating. The bowl was also full, not the careful half portions the Dursleys had occasionally allowed him, but a proper serving that suggested he was expected to eat all of it. "It's not going anywhere," Ted said gently, settling across from Harry with his own bowl. "And there's more if you want seconds." Harry looked up at him sharply. "Seconds?" "As much as you want," Andromeda confirmed, taking her own seat. "That's how meals work in this house. Everyone eats until they're satisfied." The concept was so foreign that Harry had trouble processing it. In his experience, food was rationed, controlled, used as reward or punishment, depending on how well he had managed to avoid Vernon's temper. The idea that he could simply eat until he wasn't hungry anymore seemed too good to be true. He took a tentative spoonful of soup, then another, then found himself eating with the desperate efficiency of someone who expected it to be taken away at any moment. The Tonks family watched him with expressions that mixed concern and barely restrained fury, though Harry was too focused on the food to notice. It wasn't until he was halfway through the bowl that the tears started. He didn't understand why he was crying. The soup was perfect, the kitchen was warm, and no one had yelled at him or called him freak or locked him away. But something about the simple kindness of a full bowl of soup offered without conditions broke something inside him that had been held together with 9 years of stubborn determination. "Oh, sweetheart," Andromeda said softly, moving to kneel beside his chair. "It's all right. You're safe now. You can cry if you need to." "I don't know why," Harry managed between shaky breaths. "I'm sorry. I don't usually cry." "You don't need to apologize," Dora said firmly. "And I bet you don't usually get fed proper meals either, do you?" Harry shook his head, still struggling to understand his own reaction. "They weren't supposed to be mean. Dumbledore left me with them because they were supposed to take care of me. If I was better behaved, if I didn't do freaky things—" "Stop," Ted said quietly, his lawyer's mind immediately recognizing the dangerous logic. "Harry, what happened to you wasn't because you misbehaved. It wasn't because you did magic, which isn't freaky, by the way. It's completely natural for children from magical families. It was because the adults responsible for protecting you failed in their duty." "But Dumbledore said—" "Dumbledore," Andromeda interrupted, her voice carrying enough ice to freeze the soup, "has some serious questions to answer about his placement decisions, questions that Ted and I intend to pursue through every legal channel available." Harry wiped his eyes with the back of his hand, still not entirely convinced he wasn't going to be in trouble for crying at the dinner table. "Are you going to send me back?" The question fell into the kitchen like a stone into still water. For a moment, no one spoke. "No," Andromeda said, finally, her voice completely certain. "We are not sending you back. Not to Privet Drive, not to any other relatives who might treat you poorly. Not anywhere you don't want to go. But what if Dumbledore comes? What if he says I have to go back for the protection?" Ted leaned forward across the table. "Harry, I'm a solicitor, a lawyer. My job is to understand how the law works and how to protect people using that law. And I can tell you right now that there is no law, magical or muggle, that requires a child to remain in an abusive situation for any reason. Even if there are magical protections? Even then," Ted said firmly, "protections that require child abuse to maintain them aren't protections worth having." Dora had been unusually quiet during this exchange, but now she spoke up. "Harry, can I tell you something? When I was little, maybe 6 or 7, I used to have nightmares about being sent away from my parents. Not because they were mean to me, but because other people said they weren't the right sort of family for a witch to have. Harry looked at her with interest. Why weren't they the right sort? Because Mum was disowned from her pure-blood family for marrying Dad, who's Muggle-born, Dora explained. Some people think that makes our family less important, less worthy. They think magical children should only be raised by certain kinds of families. But you stayed with your parents? Because my parents fought for the right to keep me, Dora said simply. And now we're going to fight for the right to keep you safe too. The conversation was interrupted by a soft tapping at the kitchen window. Andromeda rose to let in a small brown owl carrying an official-looking scroll. "Ministry," she said grimly, breaking the seal. Her expression darkened as she read. "Emergency hearing scheduled for tomorrow morning regarding the unauthorized removal of Harry Potter from his legal guardians." "That was fast," Ted observed. "Dumbledore doesn't waste time." "Neither do we," Andromeda replied, already moving toward the writing desk in the corner. "I'm owling Miriam to request she appear as expert witness. Ted, can you draft a formal challenge to Harry's original placement?" "Already working on it," Ted said, pulling out a legal pad. "Though I'll need to research magical guardianship law. The intersection of magical and Muggle legal systems gets complicated." Harry watched this flurry of activity with growing anxiety. "Are you in trouble because of me?" "We're in trouble because we did the right thing," Andromeda corrected. "And we'll continue doing the right thing regardless of who objects." As the evening progressed, Harry found himself in situations he had never experienced before. Dora showed him how to play wizard's chess, though the piece's tendency to shout instructions and insults alarmed him at first. Ted explained some of the legal concepts they would be dealing with, speaking to Harry as though his opinion mattered. Andromeda simply included him in the family's ordinary routines, as though he belonged there. The most foreign experience of all came when Andromeda led him upstairs to what she called your room. It was small but bright, with a real bed covered in soft blankets, a window that looked out onto the garden, and a wardrobe that Andromeda promised they would fill with clothes that actually fit him. There was even a desk where he could do homework or read books that belonged to him and couldn't be taken away as punishment. "This is mine?" Harry asked, standing in the doorway as though afraid to enter. "It's yours," Andromeda confirmed. "The bed, the wardrobe, the desk, everything. And no one will lock you in, or take it away, or make you earn the right to sleep here." Harry sat carefully on the edge of the bed, testing whether it would hold his weight. The mattress was soft, softer than anything he had ever slept on, and the blankets were thick and warm. "I don't know how to be good enough for this," he admitted quietly. Andromeda sat beside him, careful not to move too quickly or crowd him. "You don't have to be good enough, Harry. You just have to be yourself. That's all this family has ever required of anyone." That night, for the first time in his life, Harry Potter fell asleep in a real bed, in a room with a door that could be closed but not locked, surrounded by people who had chosen to protect him, not because they had to, but because they wanted to. When he woke the next morning, July 31st, his 10th birthday, sunlight was streaming through his window, and he could hear voices and laughter from the kitchen below. For a moment, he lay still, afraid that moving would break the spell and send him back to Privet Drive. But the voices continued, and when Dora's laugh rang out over something Ted had said, Harry smiled, really smiled, for what felt like the first time in years. Then he remembered what Andromeda had said about fighting for him, about legal hearings and challenges, and the smile faded. Today, people would decide his future again. Today, he might discover whether the warmth and safety of the Tonks house was real or just another temporary reprieve. But for this moment, lying in his own bed with sunlight on his face and the sound of family below, Harry allowed himself to hope that maybe, just maybe, he had finally found where he belonged. The ministry hearing was scheduled for 10 o'clock on the morning of July 31st, and Andromeda spent the early hours preparing for what she suspected would be the fight of her life. She had dealt with powerful wizards before. Growing up in the Black family provided excellent training in navigating dangerous political waters, but she had never directly challenged Albus Dumbledore. "The documentation is solid," Miriam Clearwater said for the third time, spreading Harry's medical files across the Tonks kitchen table. "Physical abuse, magical manipulation, dangerous soul magic attachment. Any one of these would be grounds for immediate removal. All three together make an overwhelming case." "Dumbledore won't care about overwhelming," Ted replied grimly, adjusting his formal robes. "He'll focus on authority, precedent, and the supposed necessity of Harry's placement. We need to be ready for arguments about the greater good." Harry sat quietly at the edge of the conversation, picking at the birthday breakfast Dora had made him. It was the first birthday meal he could remember receiving, but his appetite had vanished the moment Andromeda explained what today would bring. "What if he makes me go back?" Harry asked in a small voice. "He won't," Andromeda said firmly, though privately she wasn't as confident as she sounded. Dumbledore's influence at the ministry was legendary, and challenging him publicly would require more courage than many officials possessed. "But what if—" "Harry," Dora sat down beside him, her hair a calming blue. "Remember what I told you about my parents, fighting for me. Sometimes that means standing up to really powerful people who think they know better. Mum's brilliant at that." The flue activated with a soft whoosh, and Amelia Bones stepped through, her scarred face grim with purpose. "Mrs. Tonks, I came to escort you personally to the hearing." Andromeda stood, surprised. "Madam Bones, I didn't expect—" "After reading Healer Clearwater's preliminary report, I decided this matter required my direct attention," Amelia interrupted. "What you've documented goes far beyond simple placement disputes. If even half of these allegations are accurate, we're looking at systematic abuse of a minor and possible conspiracy charges." Harry looked up at the mention of his case, and Amelia's expression softened slightly. "You must be Harry. I'm Amelia Bones, head of the Department of Magical Law Enforcement. I want you to know that my office takes crimes against children very seriously." "Yes, ma'am," Harry said quietly, though he pressed closer to Andromeda's side. "The hearing will be conducted fairly," Amelia continued. "Professor Dumbledore's reputation will not shield him from legitimate questions about his decisions." They arrived at the ministry to find a crowd of officials, reporters, and curious onlookers gathered outside Hearing Room 10. Word had apparently spread that Harry Potter's placement was being challenged, and the wizarding world's fascination with the boy who lived had drawn considerable attention. "Stay close," Ted murmured to Harry, who had gone pale at the sight of so many people, "and remember you don't have to speak to anyone except the hearing panel." Inside the hearing room, Dumbledore sat at the respondents' table, surrounded by an impressive array of legal advisors. He looked every inch the distinguished educator and war hero, his blue robes immaculate and his long silver beard neatly groomed. When his eyes fell on Harry, they twinkled with what appeared to be grandfatherly concern. Harry's reaction was immediate and visceral. He stumbled backward, his small hands flying to his scar as though it was burning, and a sound escaped him that was part gasp, part whimper. "Harry?" Andromeda knelt beside him, alarmed. "What's wrong?" "I don't know," Harry whispered, his voice shaking. "Something about him. It hurts. My scar hurts." Dumbledore's expression didn't change, but Andromeda caught a flicker of something, calculation, perhaps, or concern, in his ancient eyes. She filed the observation away and helped Harry to their seats. "The emergency hearing regarding the placement of Harry James Potter is now in session," announced Cornelius Fudge, who was serving as chief arbitrator. "We are here to determine whether the child's recent removal from his legal guardians was justified, and whether his current temporary placement should be made permanent." Dumbledore rose first, his voice carrying the warm authority that had convinced generations of students to trust him completely. Chief Arbitrator, esteemed colleagues, I appreciate your attention to this matter. However, I must express my profound concern about the hasty actions taken by Mrs. Tonks and her associates. He gestured toward Harry with apparent affection. Young Harry Potter's placement with the Dursley family was not arbitrary. It was carefully considered, magically protected, and essential for his safety. The blood wards established through his mother's sacrifice require him to live with her sister's family. To remove him from that protection, particularly given the current climate of uncertainty about you-know-who's fate, is to put him at grave risk. Professor Dumbledore, Andromeda stood, her voice carrying the ice-cold authority she had learned from her black family training. Are you seriously arguing that magical protection justifies child abuse? I would hardly characterize the Dursleys' care as chronic malnutrition, Andromeda interrupted, reading from Miriam's report. Multiple poorly healed fractures, bruising consistent with repeated physical abuse, housing a 10-year-old child in a cupboard under the stairs. How would you characterize that treatment, Professor? Murmurs rose from the gallery, and several ministry officials exchanged uncomfortable looks. Dumbledore's expression remained serene, but his voice carried an edge when he responded. Mrs. Tonks, while I regret that Harry's experience with the Dursleys was less than ideal, we must consider the broader picture. The protection afforded by the blood wards has kept him safe from far more serious threats than domestic discomfort. Domestic discomfort? Ted stood, his solicitor's training evident in his controlled fury. Professor, would you consider it domestic discomfort if your own relatives starved you, beat you, and imprisoned you for exhibiting normal magical development? Mr. Tonks, I understand your emotional response, but let me stop you there, Ted continued. Before we discuss emotional responses, let's discuss legal ones. Can you produce documentation showing that Petunia Dursley legally consented to permanent guardianship of Harry Potter? The question hung in the air. Dumbledore's advisors shuffled papers frantically, but their expressions suggested they weren't finding what they needed. The arrangements were made under emergency circumstances, following James and Lily's deaths. Dumbledore replied carefully. Formal paperwork was less important than ensuring Harry's immediate safety. So that's a no, Ted said flatly. You cannot produce legal consent from Harry's supposed guardians, which means, under both magical and Muggle law, your placement was invalid from the beginning. Amelia Bones leaned forward in her seat. Professor Dumbledore, this is a serious allegation. If you placed a minor with relatives who did not legally consent to guardianship and failed to establish proper oversight of his care, you may have violated multiple statutes regarding child welfare. Madam Bones, Dumbledore's voice carried a subtle warning, I trust you understand the delicate nature of the protections surrounding Harry. To compromise them for the sake of bureaucratic formalities could have catastrophic consequences. For whom? Andromeda demanded. Catastrophic consequences for Harry, who has already endured 9 years of systematic abuse? Or catastrophic consequences for your reputation when people learn how badly you've failed in your duty to protect him? The hearing room fell silent. The implicit challenge in Andromeda's words was unmistakable. She was threatening to go public with evidence that would destroy Dumbledore's carefully cultivated image. Harry, meanwhile, had been growing increasingly agitated throughout the proceedings. His scar continued to ache whenever he looked at Dumbledore, and something deep in his mind was screaming warnings he couldn't understand. When Dumbledore turned to address him directly, Harry's reaction was immediate. Harry, my boy, Dumbledore said with gentle warmth, I know this has been confusing for you, but I hope you understand that everything I've done has been for your protection. Sometimes, adults have to make difficult choices to keep children safe. No, Harry said suddenly, his voice stronger than it had been all morning. No, that's not right. Everyone stared at him. Harry looked around the room with wide eyes, as though surprised by his own boldness, but he continued speaking. You never came to check on me, he said, addressing Dumbledore directly. Not once in 9 years. If you cared about keeping me safe, why didn't you make sure I was all right?" Dumbledore's expression flickered, the first crack in his serene composure. "Harry, there were constraints on how often I could visit. The protections required." "That's a lie," Harry interrupted, and this time his voice carried an authority that seemed to surprise him as much as everyone else. "Something in my head is telling me that's a lie. You stayed away because you wanted me to be weak and grateful and scared, not because you had to." The hearing room erupted in whispers and gasps. Several ministry officials looked shocked, while others appeared calculating, as though reassessing their political positions. Dumbledore's face had gone very still. "Harry, you're understandably upset. But you must not let that cloud your judgment about—" "About what?" Andromeda stood again, her fury now completely uncontrolled. "About the magical compulsions you placed on him, about the memory modifications, about the piece of Voldemort's soul you left attached to his scar while telling everyone the Dark Lord was dead." The last accusation hit the room like a physical blow. Several people cried out in shock, and 2 junior officials actually fled the chamber. Even Amelia Bones looked stunned. "Mrs. Tonks," Fudge stammered, "surely you cannot be suggesting—" "I'm not suggesting anything," Andromeda replied. "I'm stating documented medical facts. Harry Potter has been carrying a Horcrux for 9 years, and Albus Dumbledore has known about it." Dumbledore finally dropped his grandfatherly mask entirely. "Andromeda Black," he said, his voice carrying decades of accumulated authority and barely veiled threat. "You are meddling with forces beyond your comprehension. The protections I established, the sacrifices that have been made, all of it serves a purpose larger than any individual comfort or preference." "Then explain it," Andromeda challenged. "Explain to this hearing why a child needed to be tortured and manipulated for the greater good. Explain why his suffering was necessary for your grand plan." "Some knowledge is too dangerous." "For whom?" Ted interrupted. "Too dangerous for the child whose life is being destroyed by your decisions? Too dangerous for the ministry officials who are supposed to protect magical children? Or too dangerous for your reputation when people learn how you've betrayed their trust?" The confrontation had reached its breaking point. Around the hearing room, officials were choosing sides, reporters were scribbling frantically, and Harry Potter sat in the center of it all, his green eyes bright with something that might have been hope or fury. Amelia Bones rose from her seat, her voice carrying the full authority of her office. "This hearing is adjourned pending a full investigation into all allegations made today. Professor Dumbledore, you are hereby ordered to make yourself available for questioning. Mrs. Tonks, Harry Potter will remain in your temporary custody until this matter is resolved." As the room cleared, Dumbledore approached their table one last time. "Mrs. Tonks," he said quietly, his voice carrying undertones of profound threat, "I hope you understand what you have set in motion today. There are consequences to defying certain necessities." "Professor Dumbledore," Andromeda replied with a smile that would have made her black ancestors proud. "I've been disowned, ostracized, and threatened by much more frightening people than you. If you think you can intimidate me into abandoning a child who needs protection, you've severely misjudged your opposition." She stood, gathering Harry protectively to her side. "And if you ever threaten my family again, because that's what Harry is now, family, you'll discover exactly how much black family ruthlessness I inherited along with the name." The threat hung in the air as they left the hearing room, but Andromeda felt a fierce satisfaction. The battle was far from over, but today they had drawn first blood, and more importantly, they had given Harry Potter something he had never had before: a voice in determining his own fate. The medical report that would shatter the wizarding world's understanding of Harry Potter was filed at precisely 2:30 in the afternoon on July 31st, 1990. Healer Miriam Clearwater sat in her St. Mungo's office, staring at the parchment that contained the most disturbing findings of her 15-year career, knowing that once she submitted it to the Ministry's Child Protection Office, there would be no taking it back. Professional obligation, she murmured to herself, dipping her quill in red ink to mark the report as urgent, restricted access. Some discoveries were too dangerous for general circulation, but too important to suppress entirely. The report's classification ensured it would reach only the highest levels of the ministry hierarchy, the minister himself, the head of the Department for Magical Law Enforcement, the chief warlock of the Wizengamot, and a select few others with appropriate clearance. What Miriam couldn't have anticipated was how quickly word would spread through the informal networks that connected the magical world's most influential figures. Amelia Bones received her copy within the hour and immediately locked her office door before reading. By the third paragraph, she was reaching for a bottle of fire whiskey she kept for the most disturbing cases. By the report's conclusion, she was drafting orders for a full criminal investigation. A Horcrux, she said aloud to her empty office, testing the word that hadn't been spoken in official ministry documents for over 2 centuries. Sweet Merlin, he's been carrying a piece of you-know-whose soul for 9 years. She activated her secure communication mirror and called her most trusted aura. Kingsley, I need you in my office immediately. And bring Tonks, the senior one, not the daughter. We have a situation that goes to the very top. At Hogwarts, Severus Snape was preparing ingredients for the next day's potions lessons when his dark mark gave a sudden, sharp burn. Not the agonizing summons he had known during the war years, but a brief, almost questioning pulse that made him pause mid-motion. The mark had been quiet since the Dark Lord's death, or supposed death. Snape had begun to hope that perhaps the connection had finally been severed. But this felt different. Searching, as though something was testing the old bonds. When the Ministry Owl arrived an hour later, with a message marked for his eyes only, Snape's blood turned to ice. Professor Snape, your expertise in the dark arts requires your consultation on a matter of utmost delicacy. The medical examination of Harry Potter has revealed the presence of what appears to be a Horcrux attached to his magical signature. Given your previous experience with such matters, your insight would be invaluable. This information is classified at the highest levels. A. Bones. Snape sank into his chair, the parchment trembling in his hands. A Horcrux. Suddenly, everything made terrible sense. The boy's Parseltongue ability, the strange connection between Potter and the Dark Lord, the pain in the scar that had been reported by various sources over the years. He's not dead, Snape whispered to the empty dungeon. The Dark Lord is not dead, and Potter is his inadvertent anchor to life. The implications crashed over him like a tidal wave. Every year that Potter lived, every moment the child drew breath, was keeping Voldemort tethered to the mortal realm. And Dumbledore had known. The old man had to have known. Snape's hand shook as he reached for his own communication mirror. There were people who needed to be warned, preparations that needed to be made. The war wasn't over. It had never ended. In her Transfiguration classroom, Minerva McGonagall was grading summer assignments when the Ministry Owl arrived. She almost didn't open the official-looking envelope, assuming it was some bureaucratic nonsense about curriculum requirements. When she read the contents, she wished it had been. The medical report was clinical in its language, but the implications were devastating. Harry Potter, the child she had watched Dumbledore place on the Dursleys' doorstep 11 years ago, had been systematically abused while carrying a piece of the Dark Lord's soul. And according to the magical signatures documented in the examination, Albus had not only known about both situations, he had actively maintained them. "Merlin's beard," she breathed, her Scottish accent thickening with emotion. "Albus, what have you done?" She thought of the small baby in the basket, so peaceful and innocent. She thought of her own protests about the Dursleys, overruled by Dumbledore's insistence that they were Harry's only option. She thought of 11 years of refusing to check on the boy despite her growing concerns. Her first impulse was to storm into the headmaster's office and demand explanations. Her second, more considered thought was that perhaps Albus Dumbledore's explanations were no longer trustworthy. Instead, she sent an owl to Arabella Figg. Remus Lupin was in his shabby London flat, preparing for another night of searching for work that would tolerate his monthly condition when the urgent message arrived. It came not through official channels, but via the old Order network, a system of contacts and code words that had remained dormant since the war's end. The message was from Daedalus Diggle, brief and encrypted. The cub was hurt. The old wolf knew and did nothing. Gathering at the safe house tonight. Remus stared at the parchment until the words blurred. He didn't need the encryption broken to understand the meaning. Harry, James, and Lily's son had been in danger, and somehow Dumbledore had failed to protect him. "I should have checked," he said to the empty room, the words falling like stones. "I should have insisted on seeing him, just once, to make sure he was all right." But he hadn't. Like the rest of them, he had trusted Dumbledore's assurances that Harry was safe, loved, and protected. He had allowed his guilt over surviving when James and Lily died to paralyze him, convincing himself that staying away was what Harry needed. Now it seemed that trust had been catastrophically misplaced. By evening, word had spread through the informal networks that connected the magical world's most prominent figures. In quietly secured locations across Britain, conversations were taking place that would have been unthinkable just days earlier. "A Horcrux," Arthur Weasley said quietly to his wife in their kitchen after sending the children to bed early. "Molly, do you understand what this means? Harry Potter has been carrying a piece of you-know-whose soul since he was a baby." "And Dumbledore knew," Molly replied, her voice shaking with anger. "He knew that child was being abused, and he knew why the poor boy was in constant pain, and he did nothing. What are we going to do?" "We're going to support the people who actually helped him," Molly said firmly. "The Tonks family did what the rest of us should have done years ago." At Grimmauld Place, the empty house registered the magical disturbance as wards long dormant began to stir. Ancient protections placed by generations of blacks recognized that one of their own, even a disowned daughter, was under threat, and the house itself began preparing defenses that hadn't been activated since the last war. In the tower room of a distant castle, a portrait of Phineas Nigellus Black opened his eyes and smiled coldly. His granddaughter was fighting against the same sort of manipulation he had despised in life, and blood would tell in the end. Back at the Tonks house, Harry was beginning to understand that the pain he had always attributed to his scar was something else entirely. Dora sat with him in the garden, explaining magical theory in terms a 10-year-old could grasp. "So the reason my scar hurts isn't because I'm sick or broken?" Harry asked for the third time, needing the reassurance. "No, sweetheart," Dora replied patiently. "It's because someone put something inside you that doesn't belong there. But it's not part of you. It's like a splinter that's finally going to be removed. And after it's gone, I'll still be magical? I'll still be me?" "You'll be more yourself than you've ever been," Dora assured him. "Without something foreign fighting against your own magic, you'll probably feel better than you ever have." Harry considered this quietly. For as long as he could remember, he had felt like there were two different voices in his head, one that was gentle and wanted to help people, and another that whispered darker suggestions. He had always assumed the dark voice was proof that he was fundamentally wrong, somehow bad at his core. "Will the bad thoughts go away too?" he asked quietly. Dora's expression grew serious. "What kind of bad thoughts, Harry?" "Sometimes I think mean things about people who are nice to me," Harry admitted. "Or I want to hurt people who hurt others. And sometimes I know things I shouldn't know, or I can understand languages I've never learned." "Oh, honey," Dora said softly, pulling him closer. "Those weren't your thoughts. That was the piece of someone else's soul trying to influence you." The real you is the part that feels bad about the mean thoughts, the part that wants to protect people instead of hurting them. For the first time in his life, Harry began to believe that maybe he wasn't fundamentally broken. Maybe the darkness he had always felt inside him wasn't his fault. Meanwhile, in his study at Hogwarts, Albus Dumbledore sat alone, surrounded by instruments that had once helped him monitor Harry Potter's well-being from afar. Every device was now silent, their connections severed when the blood wards failed. He had spent the afternoon fielding increasingly hostile communications from former allies, each demanding explanations he wasn't prepared to give. Minerva's message had been particularly cutting. "Albus, I trusted your judgment for over 40 years. That trust is now forfeit until you can justify the unjustifiable." Similar sentiments had arrived from Arthur Weasley, Elphias Doge, and even Augusta Longbottom. Most damaging of all had been the note from Kingsley Shacklebolt. "Professor, I've been asked to inform you that the Aura Office will no longer consider you a reliable source of information regarding matters of child welfare or threat assessment." The careful network of loyalty and trust he had built over decades was crumbling, and Dumbledore found himself facing a possibility he hadn't considered in half a century, that he might be genuinely, catastrophically wrong. He rose and walked to his window, looking out over the grounds where he had once believed himself the wisest wizard alive. Below, the lake reflected the evening stars, beautiful and serene. But even that peace felt hollow now. Tomorrow, he would have to decide whether to fight to maintain control over Harry Potter's fate, or whether to accept that perhaps, just perhaps, a disowned black daughter understood something about protecting children that he had forgotten. For the first time since Tom Riddle had asked him about Horcruxes in this very office 50 years ago, Albus Dumbledore wasn't certain he knew what the right choice was. And in houses across magical Britain, former members of the Order of the Phoenix were coming to a unified conclusion. Whatever the future held, it would be decided by people who put Harry Potter's welfare above abstract concepts of the greater good. The revolution against Dumbledore's authority had begun, led by a woman who had once been cast out for choosing love over loyalty, and it was spreading through every connection that mattered in their world. Harry woke on the morning of July 31st to the sound of voices and laughter drifting up from the kitchen, and for a moment he lay perfectly still, afraid that moving would somehow break the spell. It was his birthday, his 10th birthday, and for the first time in his memory, people seemed happy about it rather than resentful. At Privet Drive, his birthday had been either ignored entirely or treated as an inconvenience. The Dursleys made a point of celebrating Dudley's birthday with elaborate parties and mountains of presents, while Harry's passed unacknowledged except for the occasional muttered complaint about another year of the freak. But downstairs he could hear Dora's voice, raised in what sounded like cheerful argument with her parents, and the clattering of dishes suggested that something special was being prepared. When the scent of bacon and fresh bread drifted up the stairs, Harry's stomach growled audibly. He climbed out of bed carefully, still half convinced that he might be dreaming. The borrowed pajamas Andromeda had transfigured for him the night before were soft and warm. Nothing like the oversized cast-offs he was used to wearing. Even his reflection in the bedroom mirror looked different somehow, less wary, less hunched, as though the constant expectation of punishment was finally beginning to fade. "Happy birthday, Harry!" Dora's voice rang out the moment he appeared in the kitchen doorway. She had changed her hair to a festive golden color that seemed to shimmer in the morning light, and her smile was so bright it was almost impossible not to smile back. "Watcher, birthday boy," she continued, bounding over to give him a gentle hug that he didn't flinch away from. "Ready for your first proper celebration?" "Is that what this is?" Harry asked, looking around the kitchen with wide eyes. The table had been set with the good china, and there were balloons tied to the back of one chair. His chair, he realized with a start. "A celebration?" "Of course it is," Ted said warmly, looking up from the stove where he was tending to what looked like enough breakfast to feed a dozen people. 10 years old is a significant milestone. It deserves recognition. Andromeda emerged from the pantry, carrying a wrapped package, her expression soft with the kind of maternal warmth Harry had only ever seen, directed at other people's children. "Happy birthday, sweetheart. We thought you might like to open your presents before breakfast." "Presents?" Harry's voice came out smaller than he intended. "For me?" "Of course for you," Andromeda said, setting the package on the table beside his plate. "Who else would birthday presents be for?" Harry stared at the gift with something approaching awe. It was wrapped in cheerful blue paper with a silver ribbon, and it looked like it had been chosen specifically for him, rather than grabbed from a charity bin or forgotten in a closet. The idea that someone had taken time to think about what he might want was almost overwhelming. "You can touch it," Dora said gently, settling into the chair beside his. "It won't bite or disappear or anything. It's yours." With trembling fingers, Harry picked up the package. It was heavier than he had expected, solid and real in his hands. When he looked up at the family watching him, their expressions were encouraging rather than impatient. "Open it whenever you're ready," Ted said. "There's no rush." Harry unwrapped the gift with the careful precision of someone who had never been allowed to tear paper carelessly. Inside was a set of books, not the battered, outdated textbooks he was used to, but new volumes with crisp pages and unbroken spines. "They're about children's rights," Ted explained. "Legal protections, magical and muggle law, how the system is supposed to work. I thought you might like to understand what your options are, so you can make informed decisions about your own future." Harry ran his fingers over the cover of the top book, reading the title, A Child's Guide to Magical Law. No one had ever given him books that weren't homework assignments, let alone books that suggested his opinions and choices mattered. "Thank you," he whispered, clutching the books against his chest. No one ever." "There's more," Dora interrupted gently, producing another package from somewhere behind her chair. "This one's from me." The second gift was smaller, wrapped in purple paper that seemed to shift colors as Harry looked at it. Inside was a set of art supplies, colored pencils, sketchbooks, charcoal sticks, and paint sets, all neatly arranged in a wooden box. "I figured you might like to try drawing," Dora explained. "Art's brilliant for working out feelings you can't put into words. Plus, if you're any good at it, you can draw embarrassing pictures of me when I'm being annoying." Despite himself, Harry laughed, a sound so rusty from disuse that it surprised him. "I've never tried drawing before." "Then you get to discover if you're terrible at it or secretly brilliant," Dora said with satisfaction. "Either way, it'll be fun." Andromeda's gift was the most practical. Several sets of clothes in his actual size, soft jumpers and properly fitting jeans that had never belonged to anyone else. But she had also included a small leather journal with his initials embossed on the cover. "For writing down thoughts, or stories, or anything you want to remember," she explained. "Private thoughts that belong to you and no one else." Harry opened the journal to the first page, where Andromeda had written in elegant script, "For Harry Potter, on his 10th birthday. May this year be the first of many filled with joy, safety, and love, from the Tonks family, with affection." The tears started without warning, not the painful, desperate crying of the day before, but quieter tears that came from a place Harry hadn't known existed, a place that could be touched by kindness instead of just pain. "Oh, sweetheart," Andromeda said softly, moving to kneel beside his chair. "What's wrong?" "Nothing's wrong," Harry managed, wiping his eyes with the back of his hand. "It's just, no one ever wrote my name like that before. Like it was something good instead of something they had to put up with." "Your name is something very good indeed," Ted said firmly. "You are something very good, and we're honored to have you in our family." Before Harry could respond, Dora launched into what she called birthday entertainment, a series of rapid-fire transformations that had him laughing despite his tears. She cycled through animal features, elephant trunk, rabbit ears, cat whiskers, before settling on a perfect imitation of Professor McGonagall's stern expression. "In my day," Dora said in a Scottish accent that was almost frighteningly accurate, "students who failed to complete their transfiguration homework were turned into teapots for a week." "She doesn't really do that, does she?" Harry asked, momentarily alarmed. "Only on Tuesdays," Dora replied solemnly, then grinned and returned her features to normal. "Kidding. McGonagall's actually quite lovely once you get to know her. Strict, but fair." The mention of McGonagall proved prophetic, because an hour later, just as they were lighting the candles on Harry's birthday cake, the flue activated, and the deputy headmistress herself stepped through in a swirl of emerald robes. "Professor McGonagall," Andromeda said, rising quickly. "This is unexpected." "Mrs. Tonks," McGonagall replied formally, then turned to Harry with an expression that mixed regret and determination. "Mr. Potter, I hope you'll forgive the intrusion, but I have come to offer you a long overdue apology." Harry stared at her, uncertain how to respond. In his limited experience, adults didn't apologize to children. They demanded apologies from them. McGonagall approached his chair and, to everyone's surprise, knelt so she could look him in the eyes. "Harry, I was present the night you were placed with the Dursleys. I expressed concerns about their suitability as guardians, but I allowed those concerns to be overruled. For 11 years I have wondered about your welfare, but I did not act on those concerns. I failed in my duty to protect you, and I am deeply sorry." You're sorry?" Harry's voice was barely audible. "Profoundly sorry," McGonagall confirmed. "No child should endure what you have endured, and no child should have to wait 10 years for adults to find the courage to help them." She glanced at the birthday cake with its 10 blazing candles, and her expression softened slightly. "I see I've interrupted a celebration. That was not my intention." "You're welcome to stay," Andromeda said carefully. "If you'd like to." McGonagall looked surprised by the invitation, then pleased. "I would be honored. It's not often one gets to help celebrate Harry Potter's birthday properly." The rest of the evening took on an almost surreal quality. Harry found himself sitting at a table with a Hogwarts professor, the family that had rescued him, and a birthday cake with his name, written in green frosting. When they sang, "Happy Birthday," his voice joined theirs for the first time in his life. "Make a wish," Dora instructed as he stared at the candles. Harry closed his eyes and wished for the simplest thing he could think of, that this feeling of belonging, of being wanted and protected, would last. He blew out all 10 candles in one breath, and the adults applauded as though he had performed magic. As the evening wound down and McGonagall prepared to leave, she paused beside Harry's chair. "Mr. Potter, I want you to know that Hogwarts will always be a safe place for you. When you're ready to begin your magical education, you'll find teachers who are committed to your well-being, not just your fame." After she left, the Tonks family settled in the living room for what Dora called birthday digestion time. Harry sat curled in an armchair that was too big for him, his new books and art supplies arranged on the side table, his stomach pleasantly full for the first time in memory. "Can I ask you something?" Harry said suddenly, looking between Andromeda and Ted. "Of course," Andromeda replied. "When you said I could stay here, did you mean forever? Or just until someone decides where I'm supposed to go next?" The question hung in the air for a moment. Ted and Andromeda exchanged a look that Harry couldn't interpret. "Harry," Ted said carefully, "we would very much like for you to stay here permanently. But there are legal processes we have to follow to make that official. What we can promise is that we will fight for the right to keep you safe, and we won't give up no matter how long it takes. And in the meantime," Andromeda added, "this is your home, your room, your books, your family. No one is going to take that away from you." Harry nodded slowly, processing this. What if Dumbledore tries to make me go back to the Dursleys? Then he'll have to go through us first, Dora said fiercely. And trust me, we're a lot more stubborn than we look. Outside, an owl tapped at the window, carrying yet another message about the ongoing investigation. The political consequences of Harry's rescue continued to spread through the wizarding world like ripples from a stone dropped in still water. But inside the warm sitting room of the Tonks house, Harry Potter was learning what it felt like to be safe. For the first time in his life, his birthday had been a day of joy rather than endurance. And for the first time in his life, he had people who were willing to fight for his right to stay exactly where he was. As he drifted off to sleep that night in his own bed, surrounded by birthday gifts that belonged to him and him alone, Harry allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, the good things in life didn't have to be temporary after all. The formal charges against Albus Percival Wulfric Brian Dumbledore were filed on the morning of August 2nd, 1990, in a ceremony that would be remembered as a watershed moment in wizarding legal history. For the first time in over a century, a sitting member of the Wizengamot's chief warlock position was being criminally prosecuted for crimes against a child. Amelia Bones stood before the assembled court in her formal crimson robes, her scarred face grim with the weight of what she was about to announce. Behind her, the evidence files rose in stacks that reached nearly to the ceiling, documentation of a systematic pattern of abuse and manipulation that had taken her department 3 days to fully catalogue. "Members of the Wizengamot," she began, her voice carrying across the ancient chamber with absolute authority. "It is my duty to inform this body that Professor Albus Dumbledore stands formally accused of the following crimes: willful child endangerment, conspiracy to conceal child abuse, illegal application of compulsion charms upon a minor, attempted memory modification without consent, and reckless endangerment through magical experimentation." The chamber erupted in shocked whispers. Even those who had heard rumors about the investigation seemed stunned by the scope of the charges. "Furthermore," Amelia continued, raising her voice to be heard over the murmuring, "these charges relate directly to the placement and treatment of Harry James Potter, the child known to this community as the boy who lived. The evidence will show that Professor Dumbledore not only placed Mr. Potter with relatives known to be unsuitable guardians, but actively maintained magical compulsions designed to ensure the child's compliance with continued abuse." In the witness preparation room adjacent to the main chamber, Harry sat with Andromeda and a gentle witch named Healer Miranda Withorn, who specialized in helping traumatized children testify in legal proceedings. Harry's hands were clasped tightly in his lap, and his green eyes held the wary alertness of someone preparing to face a predator. "Remember," Healer Withorn said softly, "you only have to answer the questions they ask. If something makes you uncomfortable, or if you need a break, just say so. No one will be angry with you for taking care of yourself." "What if I say something wrong?" Harry asked quietly. "What if I can't remember things properly, or I get confused?" "Then you tell them you're confused or can't remember," Andromeda replied firmly. "Your job isn't to be perfect, sweetheart. Your job is just to tell the truth as you experienced it." "And the truth," Healer Withorn added, "is that you survived something terrible, and that survival took tremendous courage. Today, that courage is going to help protect other children." When Harry entered the Wizengamot chamber, the sight of so many people in formal robes nearly overwhelmed him. But then he saw familiar faces in the gallery. Ted giving him an encouraging nod, Dora with her hair a supportive shade of calming blue, and even Professor McGonagall, who inclined her head respectfully when their eyes met. The witness stand had been modified for the occasion. A comfortable chair replaced the usual imposing throne, and privacy screens ensured that Harry wouldn't have to look directly at Dumbledore while testifying unless he chose to. Amelia Bones approached the stand, with the careful respect of someone who understood exactly how much courage this testimony required. "Harry, thank you for being here today. I know this isn't easy." "It's all right," Harry said, his voice small but steady. "I want to help. Can you tell us about where you lived before coming to stay with the Tonks family?" Harry took a breath and began to speak. His testimony was simple, factual, and devastating in its quiet honesty. He described the cupboard under the stairs, the irregular meals, the punishments for accidental magic, the constant message that he was unwanted and burdensome. "Did you ever tell anyone about your living situation?" Amelia asked gently. "Who would I tell?" Harry replied with the pragmatic resignation of a child who had learned early that complaining was futile. "The Dursleys said no one would believe me anyway, and that I'd be in even more trouble if I tried to get help." "Did Professor Dumbledore ever visit you at the Dursleys' house?" "No. I never saw him until the day they took me away from there." Harry paused, then added with careful honesty, "But sometimes I felt like someone was watching me, and my scar would hurt more on some days than others." The implications of this statement rippled through the chamber. If Dumbledore had been monitoring Harry remotely, he had been aware of the child's distress and chosen not to intervene. When it was time to present the medical evidence, Healer Clearwater took the stand with her comprehensive documentation. Her testimony was clinical, thorough, and utterly damning. "The physical evidence of chronic abuse was extensive," she reported, reading from her notes. "Malnutrition, evidence of multiple healed fractures, vitamin deficiencies consistent with dietary neglect, but the magical abuse was even more concerning." She gestured to a series of magical imaging devices that projected Harry's scans for the entire chamber to see. Multiple compulsion charms, all bearing Professor Dumbledore's magical signature. Memory modification attempts that were partially successful in suppressing the child's recall of particularly traumatic events. And most disturbing of all, a foreign soul fragment attached to the child's magical core. What our research indicates is a Horcrux. The chamber fell into stunned silence. Several members of the Wizengamot looked physically ill. "And in your professional opinion," Amelia Bones asked, "what was the purpose of these magical manipulations?" "To ensure compliance," Clearwater replied without hesitation. "To make the child more accepting of his circumstances and less likely to seek help or resist his treatment. In medical terms, this represents systematic magical torture designed to break down a child's natural protective instincts." When Dumbledore finally took the stand in his own defense, he carried himself with the dignity of a man who believed history would vindicate his choices. His blue robes were immaculate, his silver beard perfectly groomed, and his expression conveyed the patient sadness of someone forced to explain necessary complexities to lesser minds. "Chief Warlock Dumbledore," his defense counsel began, "please explain to the Wizengamot the circumstances that led to your placement of Harry Potter with the Dursley family." Dumbledore's voice carried its familiar warm authority as he began to speak. "The protection afforded by Lily Potter's sacrifice required that Harry be placed with blood relatives. The ancient magic involved was extraordinarily powerful, but it required specific conditions to remain effective." "And the alternative to this placement?" "Death," Dumbledore replied simply. "Without the Blood Ward protection, Harry would have been vulnerable to any Death Eater seeking revenge, any dark wizard hoping to claim credit for killing the boy who lived, or, and this was my greatest fear, the return of Voldemort himself." "Professor Dumbledore," the prosecution counsel interjected during cross-examination, "are you telling this court that child abuse was a necessary component of this protection?" "I am telling this court that difficult sacrifices are sometimes required for the greater good," Dumbledore replied. "Was Harry's situation ideal? No. But was it preferable to his death? Absolutely. And the magical compulsions, the memory modifications, were those also necessary for his protection? For the first time, Dumbledore's composure seemed to waver slightly. The child was displaying signs of trauma that threatened to compromise his ability to function normally. The modifications were intended to spare him unnecessary pain. Whose pain, Professor? His or yours when faced with the consequences of your choices? The question hung in the air like a sword waiting to fall. The revelation that shook the chamber most came during the testimony of Arabella Figg, who took the stand with obvious reluctance. Mrs. Figg, Amelia Bones asked, in your years of observing the Potter household, did you ever report your concerns to Professor Dumbledore? Every month, Mrs. Figg replied, her voice shaking with suppressed emotion. I sent detailed reports about Harry's condition, his treatment, the family's obvious resentment toward him. I begged him repeatedly to find alternative arrangements. And his response? He told me that my concerns were noted, but that the protection was too important to compromise. He said that temporary discomfort was acceptable if it preserved Harry's life. Mrs. Figg's voice hardened. He never once came to see for himself what temporary discomfort actually looked like. But the most damaging testimony came from an unexpected source. Severus Snape, called as an expert witness on dark magic, provided information that stunned even the prosecution. Professor Snape, Amelia Bones asked, based on your examination of the evidence, do you believe Professor Dumbledore was aware that Harry Potter carried a Horcrux? I am certain of it, Snape replied, his black eyes cold with fury. The magical signature is unmistakable to anyone trained in the dark arts. Moreover, certain observations I made during Harry's early years at Hogwarts suggest that Professor Dumbledore was not only aware of the soul fragment, but was actively monitoring its effects. And what are the implications of leaving a Horcrux attached to a child's magical core for an extended period? Psychological contamination, magical instability, and increasing difficulty distinguishing between the child's own thoughts and the influence of the foreign soul fragment, Snape replied. In essence, Professor Dumbledore allowed Harry Potter to be slowly corrupted by exposure to Voldemort's soul for nearly a decade. The chamber erupted in outraged voices. Several members of the Wizengamot demanded immediate votes of no confidence. From the public gallery, shouts of anger and disbelief could be heard, despite the best efforts of the court officials. When the Daily Prophet's coverage hit the streets that afternoon, the headline read simply, "The Boy Who Was Betrayed." The article, written with unusual restraint and careful attention to legal accuracy, laid out the evidence in terms that every magical citizen could understand. The public response was immediate and overwhelming. Howlers arrived at Hogwarts by the hundreds, forcing the school to implement emergency mail screening procedures. Protests formed outside the ministry, demanding Dumbledore's immediate removal from all positions of authority. By evening, an emergency session of the Wizengamot had voted overwhelmingly to suspend Dumbledore from his position as Chief Warlock and to remove him from his role as Hogwarts headmaster, pending the resolution of criminal proceedings. The evidence presented today, Chief Justice Augusta Longbottom announced with grim satisfaction, represents a betrayal of trust so profound that this body has no choice but to act decisively. Professor Dumbledore's positions of authority over children and young adults cannot be maintained while these charges remain unresolved. At the Tonks house that evening, Harry sat in the garden, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and crimson. For the first time since learning about the legal proceedings, he felt something that might have been peace. "How do you feel?" Andromeda asked, settling beside him on the garden bench. Harry considered the question seriously. "Different," he said finally. "Like maybe what happened to me actually mattered to someone besides me." "It did matter," Andromeda said firmly. It mattered enough that people were willing to stand up and say it was wrong, even when that was difficult or dangerous. Do you think he'll be punished? I think he'll face consequences for his choices, Andromeda replied carefully. What form those consequences take will be up to the courts, but what's certain is that he'll never again have the power to make decisions about children's lives without oversight. Harry nodded slowly, processing this. Good, he said quietly. Other children shouldn't have to go through what I went through just because someone thinks it's for the greater good. As the stars began to appear overhead, Harry Potter sat safe in the garden of his new home, surrounded by people who had fought for his right to be heard and protected. For the first time in his life, justice was not an abstract concept, but a living reality that had reached out and touched his world. The man who had controlled his fate for 10 years was finally being held accountable for the choices he had made, and Harry was free to begin discovering who he might become when he was no longer carrying the weight of other people's secrets and sacrifices. The legal reckoning was complete. Now the real healing could begin. The changes that swept through the wizarding world in the weeks following Dumbledore's formal charges were unprecedented in their scope and speed. What had begun as one family's fight to protect one child had catalyzed a complete re-evaluation of how magical society protected its most vulnerable members. At the Ministry of Magic, Amelia Bones stood before a hastily assembled committee of department heads, outlining new protocols that would have been unthinkable just a month earlier. Effective immediately, she announced, consulting the thick folder of new regulations. Any magical child placed with non-magical guardians must receive monthly welfare checks from certified social workers. Any child showing signs of magical suppression or trauma will be immediately evaluated by qualified healers, and any placement made without proper legal documentation will be considered invalid pending review. These measures seem rather extensive, ventured Cornelius Fudge, who had been conspicuously quiet during the Dumbledore proceedings. Minister, Amelia replied with the patience of someone explaining obvious facts to a slow child, we have just discovered that the most famous child in our world spent nearly a decade being systematically abused while carrying a piece of the darkest wizard in history's soul. If you think extensive measures are inappropriate, I'd suggest you reconsider your priorities. The committee members exchanged uncomfortable glances, but none argued further. The new protocols weren't the only changes rippling through magical society. By mid-August, the Ministry's new Child Protection Office had received over 40 inquiries from families questioning various placement decisions Dumbledore had made over the decades. The Privet family wanted to know why their Muggle-born son's magical education had been delayed for 2 years for his own safety. The Clearwaters were asking pointed questions about why their daughter had been steered away from certain career paths unsuitable for her background. And most disturbing of all, 3 families had come forward with evidence that their children had been subjected to memory modifications to protect them from traumatic magical experiences. Each case was being investigated with the thoroughness that should have been applied years earlier. Meanwhile, at the Tonks house, Harry Potter was experiencing his first formal magical education in an environment designed for learning rather than survival. Magic, Andromeda explained as they sat in the garden on a warm August afternoon, isn't just about waving wands and saying incantations. It's about understanding the connections between things, how energy flows, how intention shapes reality, how emotion can focus or scatter power. Harry watched with fascination as Andromeda demonstrated by making the garden flowers change colors with barely a whisper and a gentle gesture. At the Dursleys, when things happened around me, they always said I was doing something wrong, but I never felt like I was trying to make things happen. That's because you weren't trying, Andromeda said with a smile. Children don't control their magic consciously. It responds to strong emotions and urgent needs. When you made the glass disappear at the zoo, or when you ended up on the school roof, your magic was trying to protect you, or get you away from danger. So I wasn't being bad? You were being magnificently normal for a magical child in distress, Andromeda replied firmly. In fact, the strength of your accidental magic suggests you're likely to be quite powerful once you learn proper control. They spent the afternoon working on basic meditation and focusing exercises, not to suppress Harry's magic, but to help him recognize the feeling of it moving through him. It was the first time in his life that his magical abilities had been treated as something wonderful rather than freakish. Your mother had the same kind of intuitive magical strength, Andromeda told him as they took a break for tea. Lily was extraordinarily talented, but more than that, she had a gift for using magic to protect and heal rather than harm. You knew my mother? Harry asked, his eyes lighting up with hungry interest. Not well, Andromeda admitted. But she and your father visited Grimmauld Place once, before I was disowned. Lily was radiant, full of life and determination. She laughed at Sirius's jokes and refused to be intimidated by my mother's disapproval. Tell me more about them, Harry said eagerly. Please. So Andromeda did. She told him about James Potter's legendary Quidditch skills and his fierce loyalty to his friends. She described Lily's brilliance in potions and charms, her quick temper when she encountered injustice, her ability to see the best in people even when they couldn't see it in themselves. They loved each other deeply, Andromeda said, as the afternoon sun slanted through the garden. But more than that, they loved the idea of the family they were building. They were so excited about having you, Harry. They spent hours planning how to keep you safe and happy. If they loved me so much, why didn't they make arrangements for someone better than the Dursleys to take care of me? Harry asked, the question that had been bothering him for weeks finally finding voice. They did, Andromeda replied gently. I've been researching your parents' will, and they named Sirius Black as your guardian, with Remus Lupin as backup. The Dursleys were never supposed to raise you at all. The revelation hit Harry like a physical blow. Then why? Because Dumbledore overrode their wishes, Andromeda said, her voice heavy with anger. He convinced the Wizengamot that Sirius was a Death Eater, and Remus was too dangerous as a werewolf. He made himself your magical guardian, and placed you where he thought you should go, regardless of what your parents wanted. The injustice of it made Harry's magic flutter angrily around him, causing the teacups to rattle against their saucers. Andromeda reached out and gently took his hands. The important thing, she said quietly, is that you're safe now, and you're with people who will honor what your parents would have wanted for you. That evening, Dora took over Harry's education with what she called practical magic for real life. The stuff they teach at Hogwarts is all very proper and theoretical, she explained as they stood in the back garden. But sometimes you need to know how to defend yourself without waiting for permission or perfect wand technique. She taught him simple shield charms that could be cast wandlessly in emergencies, how to recognize the feeling of harmful magic being directed at him, and basic techniques for magical concealment. The key, Dora said, demonstrating a concealment charm that made her seem to blend into the garden wall, is to remember that your magic wants to protect you. It's not about forcing it to obey, it's about working with it. Harry proved to be a quick study, picking up the basic concepts with an ease that delighted his teachers and surprised him. For the first time in his life, learning felt like discovery rather than drudgery. Ted's contribution to Harry's education was more practical but no less important. He explained the legal protections that were now in place, the new oversight systems that would prevent another placement like the Dursleys, and Harry's rights as both a minor and a member of magical society. Knowledge is power, Ted explained, as they reviewed child protection law in his study. The more you understand about how the system works, the better you can advocate for yourself and others. Others? Harry asked. You won't be the last magical child who needs protection, Ted said seriously. What happened to you has opened people's eyes to problems that have existed for years. You have the opportunity to help make sure other children don't go through what you experienced. The idea that his suffering might serve a larger purpose was both comforting and daunting, but Harry found he liked the thought that other children might benefit from the changes his rescue had set in motion. The support from the broader magical community had been overwhelming. Owls arrived daily with letters of encouragement, small gifts, and offers of assistance from witches and wizards across Britain. Some were from famous figures, a warm note from Madame Pomfrey at Hogwarts, promising excellent medical care when he arrived at school, a gift of rare books from Ollivander about wand lore. But others came from ordinary magical families who simply wanted Harry to know he was valued. "It's like the whole magical world is apologizing," Harry observed one evening, as he sorted through the latest batch of mail. "In a way they are," Andromeda replied. "People are realizing they failed you by trusting too blindly, by not asking harder questions, by assuming someone else was taking care of things." Planning for Harry's eventual education at Hogwarts had become a community effort. Professor McGonagall, now serving as interim headmistress following Dumbledore's removal, had sent detailed outlines of the new safety protocols being implemented at the school. A special committee had been formed to ensure that Harry's transition to magical education would be smooth and supportive rather than overwhelming. "We want your Hogwarts experience to be about learning and friendship," McGonagall had written in her latest letter, "not about managing fame or repeating trauma." The most significant change in Harry's life, however, came on a quiet Tuesday morning in late August, when Andromeda called him into Ted's study for what she described as an important conversation. "Harry," she began carefully, "Ted and I have been discussing your long-term placement, and we'd like to know how you feel about the possibility of making your stay here permanent." Harry's heart leapt, but he tried to keep his expression neutral. "What do you mean, permanent?" "Adoption," Ted said gently. "Legal adoption, so that you would be our son in the eyes of both magical and Muggle law. You would keep the Potter name. We would never ask you to give up your connection to your birth parents. But you would also be a Tonks, with all the rights and protections that brings." You want to adopt me?" Harry's voice was barely a whisper. "We want to give you a permanent family," Andromeda corrected. "We want you to know that you'll never have to worry about where you belong or whether you're wanted. We want you to have the security of knowing that no one can take you away from people who love you." Harry stared at them for a long moment, processing the magnitude of what they were offering. A family, a real family, legally recognized and protected, where he belonged not as a burden or obligation, but as a chosen and treasured member. "Yes," he said suddenly, his voice stronger now. "Yes, I want that. I want to be your son." The paperwork for the adoption had already been prepared, and the process moved with unprecedented speed thanks to the public attention on Harry's case. By the end of August, the magical and Muggle legal systems had both approved the placement, making Harry Potter Tonks the newest member of a family that had chosen him as deliberately as they had once chosen each other. On the day the adoption was finalized, Harry stood in the garden where he had first learned to feel his magic without fear, surrounded by people who had fought for his right to be safe and happy. For the first time in his life, he understood what it felt like to be home, not just as a place to live, but as a people to whom he belonged. The boy who had once been called a freak, who had carried the burden of other people's expectations and secrets, was finally free to discover who he might become when he was simply loved for being himself. and in a reformed magical world that was learning to protect its children rather than sacrifice them, Harry Potter Tonks began to prepare for a future that was entirely his own to choose. The attack came on a perfect September afternoon, during what should have been an ordinary family trip to Diagon Alley. Harry had been looking forward to the outing all week, his first chance to explore magical London as part of a family, rather than as a curiosity or burden. Ted needed new quills for work. Dora wanted to browse the latest books on advanced transfiguration, and Andromeda had promised Harry they could visit Ollivander's to learn about wands, even though he wouldn't need his own for another year. They had just emerged from Flourish and Blots, Harry's arms full of books about magical theory that he had chosen himself, when the familiar voice spoke from the shadowed doorway of Nocturne Alley. "Hello, Harry." The voice that had once carried absolute authority in Harry's world now sounded tired, diminished somehow. Harry turned to find Albus Dumbledore standing just outside the flow of foot traffic, his once magnificent robes looking travel-worn and his famous beard unkempt. But his blue eyes still held that penetrating intensity that had once made Harry feel transparent and powerless. Now, however, instead of the automatic fear and compliance that would have consumed him a month ago, Harry felt only a cold recognition and a flicker of anger. "Professor Dumbledore," he said carefully, not moving closer. "You're not supposed to be here." "I know," Dumbledore replied, his voice carrying the gentle sadness that had once convinced generations of students to trust him completely. "But I needed to speak with you, my dear boy. Away from the influences that have surrounded you recently." Harry's grip tightened on his books, but his voice remained steady. "Mum says I shouldn't talk to you without a solicitor present." The word "mum" hit Dumbledore like a physical blow, and for a moment his composed facade cracked entirely. "Harry, please, just a few minutes. There are things you don't understand, things that Mrs. Tonks cannot possibly comprehend about your true situation." "My true situation," Harry repeated slowly. "You mean the way you left me to be abused for 9 years while I carried a piece of Voldemort's soul in my head?" Dumbledore winced at the directness of the accusation, but pressed on. "What happened to you was regrettable, Harry, but it was necessary. The protection afforded by your mother's sacrifice required specific conditions." "No, it didn't," Harry interrupted, surprising himself with his own firmness. "Mum researched the blood ward magic. It would have worked just as well if I'd been loved and cared for properly. You just told everyone it required abuse because it was convenient for your plans." "Harry, you must understand." "I understand perfectly," Harry said, his voice growing stronger with each word. "You wanted me weak and grateful and easy to control. You wanted me to be so desperate for approval that I'd do whatever you asked without question. That's why you put the compulsion charms on me, isn't it? To make sure I'd be obedient." Dumbledore's eyes flickered with something that might have been panic. "The modifications were for your own protection, to spare you unnecessary psychological pain." "They were to make me easier to manipulate," Harry said flatly. "Dr. Clearwater explained it all to me. You tried to suppress my natural protective instincts so I wouldn't fight back or ask for help." The old wizard took a step closer, and Harry felt the familiar tingle that meant someone was trying to use magic on him. But instead of the overwhelming compulsion that had once made him compliant and confused, he felt only a slight pressure against his mind. Pressure that his newly freed magical core pushed away effortlessly. Dumbledore's face went pale as his attempt to re-establish the old controls failed completely. "The bindings are gone," he whispered, more to himself than to Harry. "They've completely removed the bindings." "Yes, they have," Harry said with satisfaction. "And they're never going back. I know what it feels like to think my own thoughts now, and I'm never going back to being your puppet." "Harry, please!" Dumbledore's voice took on a note of desperation. "You don't understand the larger picture. Voldemort is not truly dead. The Horcrux in your scar proves that. Without proper guidance, without the protections I established, without your control, you mean," Harry corrected. "But I have guidance now. I have people who care about what's best for me, not what's convenient for their plans. And I have legal protection that you can't override anymore." Dumbledore's expression shifted, becoming calculating in a way that Harry recognized from his worst memories of the Dursleys. "Mrs. Tonks is a lovely woman, Harry, but she's not equipped to handle what you truly are. The darkness inside you, the connection to Voldemort, it will manifest in ways that will frighten her. When that happens, when she realizes what kind of monster you could become—" "Stop!" Harry's voice cracked like a whip, and the magical pressure around them intensified suddenly. Several nearby wizards glanced their way nervously as the air itself seemed to thicken with power. "You don't get to do that anymore. You don't get to tell me I'm a monster or that I'm too dangerous to be loved. I know what the darkness was now. It wasn't me. It was the piece of Voldemort you left in my head for 9 years. Even with the Horcrux removed, the connection remains." "Then I'll deal with it," Harry said firmly, "with help from people who actually care about me. People who won't sacrifice my childhood for some greater good that they're too cowardly to explain properly." By now their conversation had drawn attention. Several shoppers had slowed to listen, and Harry caught sight of a familiar figure pushing through the crowd toward them. "Harry!" Andromeda's voice carried all the fury of a mother whose child was being threatened. She reached them within seconds, her wand already in her hand, and her expression promising violence to anyone who dared harm her son. "Get away from him," she snarled at Dumbledore, positioning herself between Harry and the old wizard like a shield. "You're in violation of the restraining order. You have no right to approach him." "Mrs. Tonks," Dumbledore said, attempting to regain his grandfatherly demeanor. "I was merely trying to explain certain realities about Harry's situation that he needs to understand. The only reality he needs to understand is that he's safe, loved, and protected from people like you," Andromeda replied icily. "Harry, are you all right?" "I'm fine, Mum," Harry said, and the word came easily now, naturally. "He tried to use magic on me, but it didn't work, and I told him I'm not going to be controlled by him anymore." The pride in Andromeda's expression was fierce and warm. "Good boy. You handled that perfectly." "This is far from over," Dumbledore said quietly, his mask finally slipping completely to reveal the cold calculation beneath. "Harry Potter is too important to be left to the whims of a disowned blood traitor and her muggle-born husband. There are forces at work here that you cannot possibly comprehend. And there's the real Dumbledore." Ted's voice cut across the growing crowd as he appeared with Dora close behind him. Not the wise grandfather figure, but the manipulative controller who can't stand losing his favorite game piece. Ted was already pulling out official-looking parchment. "Professor Dumbledore, I'm serving you with notice that you're in criminal violation of the restraining order issued by the Wizengamot. You have 5 minutes to remove yourself from this area before I call for auras to arrest you." "You cannot possibly understand what you're interfering with," Dumbledore said, but his voice carried less conviction now. "Harry Potter's destiny." "Harry Potter's destiny," Harry interrupted firmly, "is his own to choose. Just like every other child should be." The crowd around them had grown larger, and Harry could hear whispers as people recognized both him and Dumbledore. Several witches and wizards were already pulling out cameras, and the sound of quills scratching on parchment suggested that reporters had arrived. Dumbledore looked around at the gathering crowd, at the family that had closed ranks around Harry, at the boy who was no longer afraid of him, and something fundamental shifted in his expression. For the first time, he seemed to truly understand that his control was gone. Not temporarily misplaced, but permanently shattered. "This will not end well," he said quietly. "When the darkness comes, and it will come, remember that I offered guidance. Remember that some battles require terrible choices." "And remember," Andromeda replied with deadly calm, "that some people hide their desire for power behind concern for the greater good. Harry will face whatever comes with people who love him unconditionally, not people who see him as a tool to be used." Dumbledore looked at Harry one last time, and Harry met his gaze without flinching. The child who had once been terrified of disappointing this man was gone, replaced by a boy who understood his own worth and had people willing to fight for it. Without another word, Dumbledore turned and walked away, disappearing into the crowd with the defeated air of someone who had finally lost a game he had been playing for far too long. The final legal hearing took place 3 days later, and this time Harry attended not as a frightened victim, but as a confident young man supported by his family. The evidence of Dumbledore's violation of the restraining order, combined with the overwhelming documentation of his crimes, left the Wizengamot with no choice but to deliver justice. "Albus Percival Wulfric Brian Dumbledore," Chief Justice Augusta Longbottom announced, her voice carrying across the packed chamber, "this court finds you guilty of willful child endangerment, conspiracy to conceal abuse, illegal use of compulsion charms, attempted memory modification, and violation of judicial restraining orders. You are hereby sentenced to 20 years in Azkaban, with the possibility of parole after 15 years, pending demonstrated rehabilitation." The sentence sent shock waves through the wizarding world, but in the Tonks family section of the gallery there was only relief and satisfaction. As they left the courthouse, Amelia Bones approached their family group. "Mrs. Tonks, the Wizengamot has one more matter to address today. The formal adoption proceedings for Harry Potter." "Of course," Andromeda replied, her arm around Harry's shoulders. The adoption hearing was brief, almost anticlimactic after the drama of the criminal trial. But when Chief Justice Longbottom announced that Harry James Potter was now legally Harry James Potter Tonks, son of Ted and Andromeda Tonks, the moment felt more significant than any of the previous legal victories. "How does it feel?" Dora asked as they walked home through Diagon Alley, "to finally be free of him completely?" Harry considered the question seriously. "Like I can finally start figuring out who I'm supposed to be," he said, "without anyone trying to control what that looks like." "And who do you think you're supposed to be?" Ted asked with interest. Harry smiled, the expression more confident and relaxed than it had ever been. "I don't know yet. But I know I'll have help figuring it out." That evening, as the family celebrated with a quiet dinner at home, Harry looked around the table at the people who had fought for his right to simply be a child. Ted, explaining some fascinating point of magical lore with his characteristic enthusiasm. Dora, changing her hair colors to match the sunset outside the window, just to make him laugh. And Andromeda, Mum, who had seen a child in need and decided that justice mattered more than safety or convenience. For the first time in his life, Harry Potter was exactly where he belonged, with people who had chosen him as deliberately as he had chosen them. And the man who had tried to control his destiny was gone, leaving Harry free to discover what kind of person he wanted to become. The war against Dumbledore's manipulation was over. The real adventure, the adventure of growing up loved and supported and free, was just beginning. 6 months after his rescue from Privet Drive, Harry Potter Tonks woke to the sound of rain pattering against his bedroom window and the smell of freshly baked bread drifting up from the kitchen. For a moment, he lay still in the comfortable warmth of his bed, marveling at how completely natural this felt now. Waking up safe, wanted, and loved in a house that had become home in every sense of the word. The transformation had been gradual but profound. What had begun as desperate gratitude had evolved into genuine belonging, and the hyper-vigilant child who had flinched at every unexpected sound had been replaced by a confident 10-year-old who knew with absolute certainty that he was valued for who he was rather than what he represented. "Harry!" Dora's voice called from downstairs, accompanied by the crash of what sounded like several pots falling. "Mum says breakfast in 10 minutes, and I may have accidentally turned the porridge purple." Harry grinned as he pulled on his favorite jumper, a soft green one that Andromeda had knitted him for Christmas with his initials embroidered in gold thread. At the Dursleys, he had owned nothing that was truly his own. Now his wardrobe was filled with clothes chosen specifically for him, books purchased because they interested him, and small treasures accumulated through 6 months of family outings and celebrations. Downstairs, the kitchen was in cheerful chaos. Dora was indeed attempting to reverse whatever transfiguration had turned their breakfast violet, while Ted sat at the table reading the Daily Prophet and offering unhelpful suggestions. Andromeda moved between them with the serene efficiency of someone accustomed to managing magical disasters. "Morning, sweetheart," she said, dropping a kiss on Harry's head as he settled into what had become his customary chair. "Sleep well?" "Very well," Harry replied, and meant it. The nightmares that had plagued his first weeks with the family had gradually faded as his sense of security grew. Now he slept deeply and dreamlessly, his body finally convinced that rest was safe. "Healer appointment at 2 o'clock, Ted reminded him, looking up from the paper. "Just the routine checkup, but Healer Whitmore wants to run a few more scans to make sure everything is still progressing well." Harry nodded without concern. The monthly medical appointments had become routine, a way of monitoring his recovery that felt supportive rather than intrusive. The latest scans had shown complete removal of all magical compulsions and bindings, healthy magical core development, and physical growth that had finally caught up to where it should be for a child his age. "Speaking of appointments," Andromeda said, producing a thick envelope from the counter. "This arrived from Hogwarts yesterday. Professor McGonagall wants to discuss your educational transition plans." The relationship with Hogwarts had been completely transformed under the new administration. With McGonagall as headmistress and a reformed board of governors, the school had implemented comprehensive changes designed to ensure that what had happened to Harry could never happen to another child. Every student now received individual attention from a designated mentor. Family situations were regularly reviewed, and the old assumption that adult authority was always correct had been replaced by active protection of children's rights and welfare. "What kind of plans?" Harry asked, genuinely curious rather than anxious. The boy who had once been terrified of any change to his routine now looked forward to new experiences with confidence. "Catching you up to proper magical education standards mostly," Ted explained. "You're already ahead of most 11-year-olds thanks to Andromeda's tutoring, but they want to make sure you're comfortable with the social aspects of school as well as the academic ones." The social development had been one of the most remarkable changes. Through the Tonks family's connections, Harry had been gradually introduced to other magical children his age. What had begun as carefully supervised playdates had evolved into genuine friendships. Just last week, he had spent an afternoon at the Clearwater home, helping his friend Jenny with a transfiguration project, while her older sister Rebecca taught them both a card game that involved making the cards dance. The children treated him as Harry, rather than as the boy who lived, partly because the adults in their lives had been careful to emphasize his humanity over his fame, but mostly because Harry himself had learned to interact as a normal child rather than as a symbol or curiosity. "Will I be ready?" Harry asked, though the question carried none of the old desperate need for reassurance. He was genuinely interested in the answer, confident that whatever challenges arose, he had people who would help him meet them. "Academically, you'll be more than ready," Andromeda said with pride. "Magically, you're developing beautifully. And personally," she smiled warmly, "you've become exactly the kind of young man your parents would have been proud to see." As if summoned by the mention of his magical development, Harry's magic chose that moment to respond to his contentment by making all the flowers in the kitchen windowsill bloom simultaneously. Instead of the shocked silence that would have greeted such a display at Privet Drive, the family burst into delighted laughter. "Show off," Dora teased, but her voice was full of affection. "Though I have to admit, that's much better than the time you accidentally turned all the spoons into butterflies." "That was an accident," Harry protested, laughing, "and you're the one who taught me the transformation theory." "Details," Dora replied airily, finally succeeding in returning their porridge to its proper color. The easy banter around the breakfast table represented everything that had changed in Harry's life. Where once he had eaten in silence, hyper-aware of every sound that might indicate displeasure from his guardians, he now participated in family conversations as an equal. His opinions were sought and valued, his preferences respected, and his presence treated as a gift rather than a burden. After breakfast, Harry settled in the study with Andromeda for his daily magical theory lesson. The education she provided went far beyond what he would receive at Hogwarts. It was personalized, comprehensive, and designed to help him understand not just how magic worked, but why he had the relationship with it that he did. "Today I thought we might discuss magical heritage," Andromeda said, opening a thick book illustrated with family trees and magical signatures. "You've been asking about why your accidental magic tends toward protective and healing effects, rather than destructive ones." "It's because of Mum, isn't it?" Harry asked. "My birth mother, I mean." Andromeda smiled at the easy way Harry had learned to distinguish between his birth parents and his adoptive ones without diminishing either relationship. "Partly, yes. Lily Potter was extraordinarily gifted at protective magic, and that talent seems to have passed to you. But it's also because of who you've chosen to become, Harry. Magic responds to the heart of the wizard, and your heart is fundamentally oriented toward protecting rather than harming. They spent the morning exploring the theoretical underpinnings of magical inheritance, family signatures, and the way personal character influenced magical expression. It was fascinating work that would serve Harry well at Hogwarts, but more importantly, it helped him understand himself as a complete person, rather than just a repository of other people's expectations. The healer appointment that afternoon brought the best news yet. Healer Whitmore, a kind woman who had been monitoring Harry's recovery since the initial rescue, smiled broadly as she reviewed the latest scan results. "Remarkable," she said, showing the images to Harry and Andromeda. "Complete physical recovery, perfect magical core development, and psychological indicators that suggest a very healthy, well-adjusted child. Whatever you're doing at home, keep doing it." "So I'm completely better?" Harry asked. "You're completely yourself," Healer Whitmore replied, which was always the goal. That evening, the family gathered in the sitting room for what had become their traditional end-of-day discussion. It was a time for sharing the day's experiences, making plans for tomorrow, and simply enjoying each other's company. "I got a letter from Jenny today," Harry said, curled up in his favorite armchair with a book about advanced transfiguration theory. "She wants to know if I can visit again next weekend. Her mum is going to teach us how to make proper butterbeer." "That sounds wonderful," Ted said, "though perhaps we should warn her family about your tendency to make things bloom when you're happy. Or turn spoons into butterflies when you're excited," Dora added with a grin. Or make books rearrange themselves alphabetically when you're concentrating, Andromeda finished. Not that anyone minds these things, but it's polite to provide warning. Harry laughed, completely comfortable with the gentle teasing about his increasingly confident magical expressions. I'll write to her tonight. Oh, and Professor McGonagall wants to schedule a visit here next month to discuss the transition timeline. Eager to get to school? Ted asked. Harry considered this carefully. Yes, but not because I want to leave here. Because I'm excited to learn more, and to meet other children who love magic the way I do. But I know I can always come home. The word home carried absolute certainty. This house, this family, these people who had chosen him as deliberately as he had chosen them. This was his anchor point, his safe harbor, his place in the world. Later that evening, as Harry prepared for bed, he paused in front of the mirror in his room and hardly recognized the child looking back at him. Where once there had been a too-thin, frightened boy with wary eyes and defensive posture, he now saw a healthy, confident young man whose eyes held curiosity rather than fear, and whose stance spoke of security rather than perpetual readiness to flee. The physical changes were obvious. He had grown several inches, filled out to a normal weight for his age, and lost the greyish pallor of chronic stress. But the emotional changes were even more profound. He looked like a child who knew he was loved, who expected kindness rather than cruelty, who had never doubted his place in the world. As he settled into bed, Harry could hear his parents talking quietly in their room down the hall, discussing weekend plans, sharing work stories, making casual references to when Harry goes to Hogwarts, and after Harry graduates, with the easy assumption of permanence that had taken him months to truly believe. Through his window, he could see the garden where he had first learned to feel his magic without fear, where he had spent countless hours being gently educated by Andromeda, where he had played games with Dora and helped Ted with the vegetable plots. Every corner of this house and its grounds held memories of kindness, of belonging, of being valued simply for existing. Tomorrow would bring new lessons, new discoveries, new steps toward the future he was learning to claim as his own. In a few months, his 11th birthday would arrive with the traditional Hogwarts letter, but instead of the terrified, isolated child who might have received such an invitation at Privet Drive, it would come to a confident young man, surrounded by people who would help him navigate any challenges that arose. The boy who had once been called a freak, who had carried the burden of other people's secrets and manipulations, who had believed himself fundamentally unworthy of love, was gone. In his place was Harry Potter Tonks, beloved son of Ted and Andromeda, brother to Nymphadora, friend to children who valued him for his humor and kindness rather than his fame. As sleep claimed him, Harry smiled at the ceiling of his own room in his own home, surrounded by his own possessions and protected by people who had fought for his right to simply be a child. For the first time in his life, the future stretched before him, not as a series of obstacles to endure, but as an adventure to embrace. And in the quiet house, where love had replaced fear, where laughter had replaced silence, where belonging had replaced isolation, Harry Potter Tonks slept peacefully, secure in the knowledge that he was finally